Welcome back to Uncharted X. This is Ben, and I hope you're all well. We're going to be doing something a little different today. This isn't one of my normal scripted videos, instead it's a version of the presentation that I gave recently at the Cosmic Summit conference. It's about the evidence for ancient high technology, something I've been calling a tale of two industries. I really wanted to put this out on my channel as a thank you to all of the viewers and subscribers and supporters of the work that I've been doing over the last few years. I really wouldn't have even been able to give this presentation at the Cosmic Summit if it weren't for all you guys, and I wanted to make sure it was available for everybody to see and not just stuck behind a paywall. This isn't scripted. I wanted to take my time and go through this material thoroughly. It's quite a bit longer than the version that I gave at the Cosmic Summit in only about an hour and a half, so I really hope you enjoy it. Just a quick note before I get started here that I will be joining Randall Carlson on a Mega Floods of the Ice Age tour in Montana in September of 2023, and if you're interested in joining us on that trip, check out the links below in the description. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Cheers. Essentially, this is the topic we're covering today is something I'm calling a tale of two industries. It's the evidence for ancient technology, primarily focused in Egypt, although for sure this is something we could extend to South America and many other places around the world. First of all, who am I? Most of you should know my name is Ben. The rest of my name is Van Kirkwick. I'm an Australian by origin. I'm an expatriate. I've been living in the USA for nearly 18 years now. Prior to embarking on this strange career as a YouTuber and an independent researcher, I had a 20-year career in the network world as essentially a network architect, a technologist. I spent the last sort of almost decade of that working in the Chief Technology or CTO office, the Chief Technology Office for Hewlett-Packard. And this has really shaped a lot of my perspectives around technology. I did a lot of technology planning, long-term technology strategy, R&D investment, mergers, acquisitions. I was essentially an individual contributor creating technological architectures. I've got a couple of patents, things like that. It was a fun career, but this career and this topic, this area is of much more interest to me. I've always been a fan of history. I've been a student of it for a long time. I nearly went that direction when I was in university, but obviously decided there was more money to be made in the IT side of things. So I went that way, but I never lost my interest in it. My mother was a history teacher, and I really got started on this when I had the chance to meet Graham Hancock. His work, Fingerprints of the Gods, was a big influence on me. And then in 2013, I had the chance to meet and travel with him through Peru and Bolivia. And then again in 2015, I was in Egypt for the first time for me, and that was on a tour also with Graham Hancock. That was also the source of the famous debate, if you've ever seen it, between Graham Hancock and Zahi Hawass. There's some clips of that on the internet. And after that, it was like, man, damn, there's a lot here to explore. There's a lot here to try and share with people. And that's pretty much shortly after that is when I started going full-time and pursuing these mysteries and investigating these things full-time. All of my work's published on YouTube, also on UnchartedX.com. I'm also on several other platforms now. I'm on Spotify, I'm on Rumble, and you can find my work all over the place, but essentially my website is where everything is always published. So the best place to start with this, I think, is a grounding in what is the orthodox story of history. So what is our perspective on human civilization, on evolution of our species, and how did we get to where we are today? And I'd like to start this with kind of I guess you would call it the standard model view as it was, nearly 20 years ago now, roughly. In 2006, this was a New Scientist article that was published 2006 and talking about the timeline of human evolution, and this pretty much represented the view of civilization, the history of humans and civilization. And it really has not changed very much since then, but this was pretty much how we've been looking at it for a long time now. It starts around 195,000 years ago, which is when our own species, Homo sapiens, first seemed to appear on the scene. After that, we began to migrate across Asia and Europe. This was determined by carbon-14 dating of, at the time, the oldest modern human remains, which were skulls found in Ethiopia. And roughly, call it 200,000 years ago is when they think our species first appeared on the scene. 50,000 years ago was the great leap forward, almost the beginnings of culture and religion, when we started to ceremonially bury our dead, do things like create, clothes from animal hides, develop complex hunting techniques, things like that. It also corresponds with the date that they think was the first colonization of Australia by modern humans. 12,000 years ago is when it is thought that humans first reached the Americas. This is also often considered or talked about as the Clovis people, or the Clovis boundary. It has long been held as a fairly strong doctrine in archaeology that there were no humans in the Americas prior to this date of 12,000 years ago. And then around 10,000 years ago, we start to see the beginnings of agriculture. This spreads from the verdant sort of Crescent Valley and the top of Mesopotamia, and we start to see the development of, with agriculture, you get villages, you get specialization, you get the progression of human culture that eventually leads towards civilization. There have been several advances in the dating of agriculture since then. Roughly after this period, 4,000 to 3,500 BC, or if we go with the same terminology, the rest of it, 6,000 to 5,500 years ago, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia developed what is thought to be the world's first civilization. So really only a brief period of time from where we stand today. The Sumerians begin it, and of course they are closely followed by people like the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Roman, the Chinese, and civilization spreads across the world, essentially putting us on a path to where we stand today. And this is the standard model of history, and really this hasn't changed very much since this article was published in 2006, particularly dates like the beginnings of civilization. If you think about it in the overall timeline of humans, it really isn't a very long time, and you can pretty much phrase it like this, as if we've gone from the Stone Age to the space shuttle in only 6,000 years. Gone from riding on caves to some very advanced technology, spreading out into space in a really short period of time when you look at the overall timeline of the human species. An interesting part of this is that I do think that this idea that we've gone from essentially cavemen in the Stone Age to our modern society is a tenet of what it means to be a modern human in today's world. This is it's a concept that's baked into all of us. It's not
what is up,
knows
Quills? Where is this guy headed? What's on, man?
The process or the path that this took in detail.
Oh yeah, you totally disagree with this. I love it, man. I love it.
Has emerged from this Stone Age. It's obviously in ancient civilization. There's been ups and downs, but essentially
I've got no horse in the race, my man. You might not like his conclusions. I'm not gonna lie. You're probably gonna squirm a lot. Please don't unfollow me.
We're the only advanced civilization, and this has only happened in the most recent millennia of human existence on this planet. It really forms a core tenet in what it means to be a modern human today. And I think it's a really important concept. We're going to come back to this at the end of the presentation and maybe examine what it might be like if we could change this concept. So what's happened since 2006?
My interest in this is fun, but I mean there are a lot of things that are really just crazy, man. Like the obelisk, the unfinished obelisk in Aswan.
And these vectors are coming from multiple different directions. We're going to briefly cover some of these and then focus mainly on the evidence for ancient technology.
Talked about friggin' Mount Rushmore and everything. And we talked about the diorite bowls, the person that Spanish lady made it by hand. That was wild.
Massive effect on the standard model of history and certainly that of human civilization. There's been a lot
remember
of
it all,
advances
man.
in science and discoveries
I remember
that
it all.
relate to the human timeline itself. There's DNA evidence that folds into that. Obviously, we have our
I'm setting myself up here one sec, dude.
A whole component of this, and a lot of the modern science that's happened in the last 20 years is really showing that there are grains of truth in the origin stories that we see from cultures all around the world. And then, of course, a really big one, I think the key that unlocks all of this information, that unlocks all of these possibilities, is cataclysm. We've discovered the actual truth of real cataclysm that's occurred in the recent past, particularly with the work of the Comet Research Group and discovering the effects and the impacts and the airbursts of the period known as the Younger Dryas period, which we'll talk about briefly. Starting off with archaeology, there's obviously one of the very big discoveries that most people should be aware of is that there's been a tremendous amount of discoveries happening in Turkey. And this started with the site known as Göbekli Tepe, which is located in southeastern Turkey, near the modern city of Şanlıurfa, which was the biblical Edessa, the city of prophets, also known as Urfa at some point.
That's funny,
it's
man.
part of the, it's the northern end of what was Mesopotamia. Funny. That city's been there for thousands and thousands of years. It's a holy city for many religions, as it deals with a lot of the characters from the Old Testament. And close to this site, it was originally discovered in the 1950s, this site of Göbekli Tepe. Funnily enough, in the 50s, this site was dismissed as being they didn't think it was very ancient because the architecture was too good, so it wasn't really investigated. And it wasn't until work started in the late 1990s by the German Archaeological Institute that they started to uncover this site and dig down and found out that no, in fact, this site is tremendously ancient. And in fact, it's much more ancient than we had thought. And it's certainly much more ancient than any dates for civilization. It's been firmly carbon-14 dated to at least 12,000 years old. So we're talking 10,000 BC for this site. It's a massive megalithic site. If you've not seen it, I got the chance to visit it myself earlier this year in 2023. They've only uncovered some 5, maybe 10% of the site. There is huge amounts yet to be uncovered. I'm not sure if they're ever going to, but they've been scanning it. They know the site extends a lot further than what is currently uncovered.
Göbekli Tepe?
It consists of a number of stone circles. Some of these stone circles, recent studies have shown that the circles themselves are arranged in very interesting geometric patterns. Some of them
How did you get that year?
Many of these circles also have alignment properties in terms of aligning to significant celestial events, things like solstices and equinoxes. The stone circles themselves are really interesting in their construction because many of them consist of these very large single-piece T-pillars. These are made
I've
from
heard carbon, from the...
Some of them are just massive. They range
I've
up in size
read online
15 tons, 20 tons.
That the carbon dating says like 11,000 years or something.
Really good reconstructions of these pillars in the Schönlöfer Museum in the city of Schönlöfer. And it's not just stone circles
carbon dating
that we found at this site. It's buildings, quarries, we have stone-cut systems.
Especially with like human
there
sites.
There is signs of occupation and
sites,
what
not really the
might
best
term civilization here. As I said, a lot of these circles and their properties are astronomically aligned. The work of Martin Sweatman has suggested that the figures that are carved into the stone pillars might represent a celestial calendar.
So I take carbon dating with a huge grain of salt if it's an ectogenic site. I know it
there was a thought
ridiculous,
at some point that this was deliberately buried, although the science and the research on this is starting to shift.
Because apparently it was intentionally buried.
What I'd say is most interesting about Göbekli Tepe is when you look at the way it's been buried or it's been covered in. You can clearly see two forms of construction here, right? There is a sophisticated form of stonework in the monoliths themselves and in their carvings, and then there is a much more primitive version that really makes up the walls that encompass these stone circles.
Yeah, I mean...
and the interesting thing to me is that
it doesn't
the
have to
be, dates and the way that they've actually dated this site comes from material that they found
even if the range is like 5,000 years, I think it's
other
okay
material
for
or anything on the ground. They found organic material in these walls. And those walls,
but you can't have like a range of like 5,000 to 0.
What's interesting to me is that in a lot of cases these walls encompass the pillars. Like
for
they
this
actually
place,
cover up previously made details on the pillars. And in some places here you can actually see chunks of broken pillars
but apparently
that have been
intentionally
used
buried,
as stones in the walls themselves.
A lot of mysteries, man. I think
this is certainly suggestive of a much later period. Period of building. Maybe it was used to restore and renovate the site, to repair it, to protect it.
Dude, this is a 2.5 hour essay video he made.
Longer story to this site.
Presentation. It's called The Tale of Two Industries. So let's see. I haven't even seen this video.
Göbekli Tepe itself.
I think I know what he's going to say.
This was thought to have been just a revolution in terms of ancient history. It was kind of a bombshell at the time that it dropped on us, and it wasn't received that way within
Go follow Uncharted X on YouTube. Thank you, Ben, for
although there are a few dissenting perspectives on this.
Play your video on Twitch. I know you're on
Twitch
Twitch too,
investigating
Ben. You have more followers than me, bro.
Please don't people like Graham Hancock. This is, to me, a pretty clear indication of civilization. Like, you need
the presenter
specialization in order to develop stonework of this magnitude and the size and scope of the site. You need people to be able to specialize in their crafts in terms of feeding. You need community, you need society, you need civilization in order to build something like this and build it on this scale. But
there's some advanced
rather than actually
tools,
changing that 6,000-year-old date of civilization.
But I mean, I don't know.
Instead, and if you can still see this on the Wikipedia page for Göbekli Tepe,
it could have been reused.
Instead, they just changed the definition of what it meant to be a hunter-gatherer. Because in the past, doing megalithic stonework in blocks up to 20 tons was not included as an activity.
If they had metal tools,
that hunter-gatherer tribes and nomadic people did.
Yeah, really.
Now apparently this was purely a ceremonial site for hunter-gatherers. I think this is complete nonsense.
I mean, yeah, you can't.
But that's how it's been treated, and that date of civilization remains firmly established at around 6,000 years old.
Something because of a lack of evidence. I mean, the evidence is in the not that there's evidence for something, but
potentially
just
vastly older when you consider
final
the
product, right? I'm not
saying
that the final product
what's happened in recent years,
how
I'm
they
talking
made
the last 5 or 6 years, I think
should
should really be challenging this perspective on civilization, because it turns out Göbekli Tepe is not even close to being the only site that's now been discovered in this part of Turkey. Another site was uncovered and found nearby. It's very close to Göbekli Tepe. It's older than Göbekli Tepe. The dating that has come back from this site establishes
rocks.
it
Well,
at
I don't know,
least
man. Like metal,
years older.
If they have metal, it could have just been reused, repurposed.
It shares an architecture with Göbekli Tepe. There is a lot of these pits that are dug down to bedrock. You see shapes that are formed out of the bedrock.
It seems like they may not have used metal.
A much bigger site.
Seems like they may have used some sort of
it's 5 times larger, as far as we know. It's only the excavations here have only just begun.
Granite on granite, quartz on
recent
granite,
years.
or some shit.
So far, we've discovered at least 250 T-pillars on the site. There might be up to 1,000 T-pillars on this site.
Summary.
And I also visited this site in early 2023, and there's actually a T-pillar that's still in a quarry. Like, it was never detached from the bedrock, but this T-pillar must have weighed probably about 30 tons. It's a huge piece, and in fact, on this image you can see here, those piles of rocks in the center of this enclosure, they're actually T-pillars that have fallen down and then they have eroded. They've fallen apart, and I don't know how much time it would have taken for this to happen before the site was eventually covered and buried in sediment. But we don't really know how actually old this site is.
50-ton block
what's even more impressive now
from
is that these aren't the only sites that they found in southeastern Turkey. There's many other sites now coming to light that institutions and archaeologists have started looking for them. In fact, 40 to 80 more sites just like these are now coming to light.
How did they do it?
It starts to become pretty ridiculous to suggest that, well, no, these are just ceremonial hunter-gatherer sites that these guys were working on weekends in order to get away from the women and children.
In Finland, from St.
When you start talking about 40 to 80 of these types of installations all over the place, and some of them are truly massive in scale.
They dried
it's clearly indicative that there's been a huge chapter of human civilization that's been lost to us, that we know nothing about. And I can only equate it and compare it to the similar set of discoveries that are happening in the Amazon basin, thanks to deforestation.
But man,
LiDAR scannings, we're seeing the same sort of thing emerging from the Amazon. Tremendous evidence for tremendous cities, huge earthwork.
To become a passionate opinion on something.
Just a whole chapters and completely lost
or rather,
episodes
it seems
of
like
human civilization
it's
that
still
happened at we don't know when, but certainly a long time ago. And I think these sites in southeastern Turkey should really be shaking up what we think of as the earliest dates for human civilization. Not only that, but the Clovis doctrine in North America, in the North American states and South America, has been severely challenged over the last 20 years. The Clovis doctrine, if you like, this date of 12,000 years, was the earliest time that we saw humans in the Americas. There's now more than half a dozen sites that have really challenged this, that are using techniques like carbon-14 dating. In particular, the Bluefish Cave site, which is in the Yukon, it shows that there were humans working on this site and doing things at this site 10,000 years earlier than that, so roughly 25,000 years ago. There's a whole bunch of different sites that are suggestive of this. Unfortunately, there was a very strong doctrine associated with this Clovis first concept in the Americas and in the Archaeological Institute. In fact, Zhang Xingmars, who was the discoverer of Bluefish Cave, was actually run out essentially of the academic environment. He just basically laughed out of the room every time.
Something like Stonehenge, like an astrological
by his colleagues, and it caused him, he was depressed by it. It caused him a lot of personal problems. It's really unfortunate to see the resistance that was put forth to what is in fact really strong new evidence that humans have been in this part of the world for a lot longer than
like this, the scorpion
originally established. But as of this point, there are more and more sites coming up that are showing no. In fact, there is evidence for human occupation in the Americas long before the 12,000-year-old Clover doctrine. The timeline of human evolution itself is changing. We were at around 200,000 years old with the skulls found in Ethiopia. There was now a jawbone that's been found in Morocco that was carbon dated to 300,000 years ago, so instantly adding another 100,000 years to the timeline of the human species itself. This is essentially, walking, talking humans. If you shave them down and put some clothes on them, they wouldn't look any different to you and I.
Come on,
but now the actual fossil record, as far as we know, is shifted back to 300,000 years ago. And the story gets even stranger when you start to look at some of the new science involving teeth morphology and DNA. There's been a recent study in 2019 looking at the morphology of teeth, of tooth evolution, essentially. We're looking at now the divergence. How old and where are they? Neanderthals being our cousins, essentially. We and the Neanderthals diverged from a common species at some time in the past. And in order for us to get the teeth that we have in that short period of time, our teeth would have had to evolve at just a much higher rate than was expected. But the researchers found that this isn't the case, and that in fact dental evolution rate happens very slowly. So statistical analysis on this research, on this data, essentially suggests that the divergence of
there's a lot of
from a common ancestor,
a lot of interesting old megaliths
Homo sapiens
lined up
and
in France and Brittany.
Our cousins, happened at least 800,000 years ago. So we're now pushing back the timeline for the human species itself to somewhere around 800,000 years. And in fact, this is also supported by DNA research. So looking at the DNA itself, looking at when did we diverge from a common ancestor with the Neanderthals. There was a paper published in 2003 that put that date at somewhere in the range of 631 to 790,000 years ago.
Well, they think
if you want to round up, you can say I think the window for human beings on this planet might be up to 1 million years.
England and Denmark.
Certainly 800,000 years of time on the planet.
That went underwater.
It's a long cry from the 200,000 years that
10,000 years
originally thought. I mean, prior to that, we thought we were about 50,000 years old as a species. And now we're going back into periods of time that go far, beyond the glacial maximum of what we think of as the last ice age. It goes back into periods of warmth. There is tens of thousands of years of
Isn't that funny how video games bring us together?
Amongst all of that, and
but it's
something I always like to say is that if you give human beings enough food to eat in warm weather, we start solving problems.
Bring us together.
And I think this opens up the window for all sorts of potential previous chapters of potentially civilization, way back within these periods, not just 15,000 years ago, but potentially hundreds of thousands of years ago. The evidence for this type of sophistication in the human genome has also been shown by genetic studies that were revealed recently, looking at the affinities between different haplogroups, so different ethnic groups of people from around the world. And what this map is showing you here with the red dots is that it's been discovered that there is a deep affinity that exists between the people of Australasia and the peoples of South America. Now, you'll notice that these red dots don't extend from South America up into Central and North America.
Why do you
and
say
this
that?
is a real problem for the proposed diaspora of humanity and the way that human beings, starting in Africa and going across Asia and then down into the Americas through the Bering Land Bridge, down through North America, Central America, and eventually hitting South America. If that was the case, we would see this genetic markers and these affinities
crazy,
in North America and in Central America. We just don't see that. What we do see is an affinity that stretches across the
really wild.
ocean, which is the largest body of water on the planet.
Like it's insane.
And it's suggestive.
That's really wild.
It's very suggestive of a large migration that must have occurred at some point deep in the past that left these genetic indicators that we're now finding today. It's showing that our history as a race is much more complex than we had originally thought. Then, of course, the key that unlocks it all for me and for many people, I think, is the discovery of the Younger Dryas cataclysm. This was speculated about in Graham Hancock's work from 1995, Fingerprints of the Gods. This wasn't really discovered scientifically until around 2007, when the first papers were started to be published, when scientists were actually using Clovis sites that went back to 12,800 years old in the strata And by analysing these different layers in the strata, they found all of this evidence for what you would call impact proxies. Essentially the signatures that are left from cosmic airbursts and extraterrestrial impacts, and it's all shown in this what's called a black mat layer that we found now all over the world. North America, Europe, South America, even South Africa, we found evidence for this black mat layer, as well as impact proxies, things like shock synthesized nanodiamonds, extraterrestrial platinum and iridium. It's very indicative of a massive cataclysm, and it correlates to a period in time that's called the Younger Dryas, and this stretches from 12,800, 900 years ago to around 11,600 years ago. There's been many sites, and more than 50 now sites around the world. There's something like 150 plus peer-reviewed scientific papers that are now supporting this evidence. And it's not only supported by these impact proxies, but it's also shown with the research that's gone into ice cores. So these samples of ice cores that we take from places like Antarctica or Greenland or Russia, we're getting very good at the analysis of looking at the different, basically yearly accumulations of ice. So every year when the snow lands and it freezes to ice, it captures things, levels of oxygen isotopes, things like that can help us to determine temperature and, was how much of the world was on fire, things like this. And those ice cores have been very, very helpful in showing the true sort of climatic history of the planet. And it shows that, we're warming up from the last glacial maximum. But at around that 12,900 year
data that shows
we
there
just
has
get
been
plunged
impacts
back very
like
rapidly
from
to
torrid
the
meteor
depths
stream,
of
maybe,
glacial cold,
or
and that
a comet or
exists
something,
for a period of nearly 1,000 years, up until
but the link in
years
the
ago, a little bit longer, in fact. And then we're sort of shocked back out of that, and it comes
asteroids,
up,
right?
and we sort of
Without
continue on this path of gradual
cataclysm?
warming and enter the Holocene, which is the era we're in today.
I don't know the extent of the impact of these
the
asteroids,
history of temperatures and climatic
probably,
conditions
which is
on the
very
planet,
probably
we've really had
the theory,
a
the
10
main
or 12,000 year period of what is
there just might have been just
very
like
nice
increased
weather.
asteroid activity at the time that didn't wipe out civilization.
Now, as part of those ice core samples, we also found some other amazing indications of just catastrophic events that happened during the Younger Dryas. One of those was indicative of up to 9% of the biomass of the planet being on fire, which is just an absolutely mind-boggling number when you think about how much that means. There's actually these soot particles in the layers from those years that show that there were tremendous fires all around the world.
Primary source.
This period of time also corresponds with what you would call the last great extinction event. The megafauna that existed in particularly North and South America and Europe, the mastodons, the mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, direwolves, just a huge number of species, these large animals, megafauna, or anything I think that's over around 40 kilograms in body weight. Almost,
I think they just don't like
half
them, though.
of the species
I think
that
that's
were around in
standard.
that period, they all went extinct within a very short period of time. This also corresponds with this Younger Dryas boundary right around this date. So something traumatic happened. And, all of the science that's now happened in the last 20 years is pointing to a series of cosmic airbursts,
especially with
and
this
impacts,
new woke world,
likely as part of a disintegrated comet that forms an asteroid belt around the sun. It's called the torrid meteor stream. We pass through it twice a year, and it seems likely that may have been the source for this debris that the planet ran into and caused this tremendous cataclysm. Although it's not tightly coupled with it, it was probably also a precipitating event that caused sea levels to rise some 400 feet since that time, since the last glacial maximum. So the surface of the planet really changed dramatically as a result of this. And I could safely say that should this type of event happen today, it would be a civilization ender. The way of life as we know it would be over. Our cities would be emptied. There would be a massive depopulation of humans. I should also say that there is corresponding DNA evidence in the human genome that corresponds with the Younger Dryas. There was a drop in population as well as genetic diversity that happened across the planet around the period of the Younger Dryas. So, we were megafauna, we went through it, we survived it, much as did any other species of megafauna that's alive today. But almost half of the megafauna at the time didn't. And, it was a traumatic event, and, we lived through it, which I think makes it really interesting when you go back and look at what our origin tales are. Across cultures, both modern and ancient, you can't poke a stick at any of them that don't include stories of things like, catastrophic floods or world-ending fires. I mean, these accounts of these types of things are embedded in our religions and in our cultures. They have characters and stories and gods written up all around them. But essentially, I think there's a chance that at the core of these things, they might actually be containing what could have been eyewitness accounts of some of the actual destruction that happened, either in the Younger Dryas or potentially periods before that. We know that humans lived through this, that we would have witnessed it. Lots of humans would have likely died. And I mean, how do you encode data and remember events when you're talking about an oral history? I mean, at the time, books or any form of writing, if it even existed, wouldn't have survived.
Yeah.
You pass these things down generation by generation as stories, as oral tales, and so they build up.
I don't know though.
Characters and stories around these things, but at their core,
today.
We have this story of cataclysm that humans went through, and in many of these cases, even in the
little diary
modern day Christianity, the stories of the book,
very convincing.
They talk about a civilization existing beforehand that was destroyed. Humanity was forced to start again. And this is represented across cultures. It's in the ancient Egyptian stories. It's in, the Native American tribal stories. It's in South American histories. It's in Nordic religions. It's in
Spanish
Inuit stories. It's in the Mahabharata and Hindu traditions. It comes from all around the world because these cataclysms and things like the Younger Dryas were a global effect. And for anyone that's interested, we could spend hours talking about individual things. I do have a video. This is the screenshot from the video. It's on my channel. That kind of dives into some of these origin tales and what potentially and the relationship they might have with the Younger Dryas cataclysm itself. And now we come to what is the core topic for this presentation, which is the plethora of ancient advanced artifacts and technology that seem to come from some of the earliest times of known history. In this presentation, we're going to focus primarily on Egypt, as I said up front, but there are certainly lots of artifacts and stonework and things like that we can look at from all around the world, but we don't have unlimited time to go through all of this stuff. I do have videos that cover some of those other places, South America, Baalbek, places like that. But particularly in Egypt, I think it's the most well preserved of our ancient civilizations, and it has some of the most just remarkable artifacts. And these artifacts come in sizes small and large. You can see here the schist disc, the unfinished obelisk, precision-made boxes, vases, columns, and statues. And in a lot of cases, these things are coming from the very earliest times of known ancient civilization, and they represent technology that, really is far beyond the capabilities of the tools that we know were used during those times in dynastic Egypt. And often, when we're talking about vast periods of time, the question of, how come we're just looking at stonework? Where are the tools? Now, we could spend hours talking about where are the tools, but I think when you're talking about periods of vast antiquity, the stonework is really all that's left. That's what weathers time the best. Certainly anything metal is extremely precious. Gold and silver on its own, they're only decorative. They're essentially useless for tool use or weapon use. But any metal that is found throughout just thousands of years of known history would have been taken and would have been reused,
tools?
and it would have been melted down and reshaped to form some other purpose, regardless of what it was. Not only that, lots of types of metals, iron, copper, things like that, can oxidize and rust and just, over... In some cases, as little as a century or two just turn to powder and aren't there. So primarily we're left with the stonework. But from the stonework and the tools and the precision of the stonework and analysis into their engineering, we can determine an awful lot about the tools that must have been used, or what it must have taken to actually create these artifacts. Not only that, but we also have science of some of the tools, and some of them seem to be extremely sophisticated. In fact, you can only really call it machining at some level. We have evidence for saw cuts, very advanced stone cutting.
Harder.
Not only straight saws, but also circular saws. We've got evidence for advanced tube drilling and other mechanisms for removing pieces of stone. There is, in the top left of this image, you see what looks like it's an unfinished surface on a bullnose that's on a box that's found at Elephantine Island. That's quite clearly been machined in very straight lines before it was finished and rounded off to make it perfectly semicircular. It's an unfinished piece of work, which are actually quite valuable because they do leave tool marks that otherwise might have been polished out.
Do you think it had steel?
And it's evidence for some very advanced tools and techniques that must have been used in order to make these marks. We can also determine the sophistication of some of these manufacturing systems through the geometry of objects themselves, like center bottom here, you're looking at one of the cornice blocks that you can find on the Giza Plateau. That is just a tremendously complex compound curved surface that is just perfectly flat to the eyeball. We've taken extremely sophisticated manufacturing techniques to make this. We're going to explore some of these topics a little bit as we move forward in this presentation. But it is worth remembering at the same time, how are these generally explained by the standard model, by Egyptologists and archaeologists? Well, they're explained with these sort of tools, because these are the tools that we found. I talked a little bit about metal earlier. You could probably take all of the metal tools that have been discovered across all of ancient Egypt and they would fit into a very small room. It's incredibly rare and precious.
So you think we use like copper saws
metal tools
to make everything in Egypt?
But you can see they're very primitive. You have copper chisels and adzes. I think even so, like bottom left here, these tools weren't ever meant for stonework. These are more likely plaster tools or perhaps woodworking tools.
That's the point. Like
we also have things like flint chisels. Flint chisels were used as a very hard substance to carve pieces of stone before people got around to figuring out iron and steel in later periods. Certainly flint's much harder than copper or bronze.
Interesting.
And then the other tools were just pounding stones. That's pretty much it. That's the ancient Egyptian toolbox right here on a single page. And the interesting thing is that the capabilities and the capacity to create stuff with these tools is massively exceeded by the evidence that we have in stonework itself. And in fact, what I'm going to show you is that there exists across a lot of different categories of artifacts, two different classes of objects. Some that represent the capabilities of tools like these, and another class that really doesn't. Before we get into there, it's probably worth grounding ourselves just a little bit in terms of what we talk about when we get into Egyptian history, or the orthodox history of the Egyptian civilization, also known as the dynastic Egyptian civilization. It's good to put some of this into context so that when we talk about Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, Ptolemaic times, we understand what dates we're talking about. And the Egyptian civilization itself kicked off earlier than 3000 BC, roughly 3150 BC, with Menes, who was the first pharaoh of the very first dynasty. He got started. That's something called the early period. This encompassed the first two dynasties. Then we went into the Old Kingdom, which is the period associated with just the mega pyramid builders, massive sites like Saqqara and Giza, the Great Pyramid, the Middle Pyramid. All of this happened in the Old Kingdom. There was some remarkable pieces of work that are attributed to the Old Kingdom. In between these periods, there was something known as an intermediate period, which basically means there was civil strife, for want of a better term, inside of Egypt. The upper and lower kingdoms were potentially disconnected. There might have been different rulers before the land was again reunited into the Middle Kingdom, which was dynasties 11 through 14, another intermediate period.
I'll be honest.
Then the New Kingdom. This is made famous by pharaohs such as Ramses the Great, Seti the First, Ramses' son Merenptah. We'll talk a little bit about them later on. Another longer intermediate period, then a late period, and then the Ptolemaic period, which was essentially the Greek-Roman period of ancient Egypt. And in fact, the dynastic civilization, as we know it, came to an end when Cleopatra VII committed suicide. Yes, it's that Cleopatra. There were a number of other Cleopatras before her, but Cleopatra VII quite famously committed suicide, and that happened around 30 BCE.
I don't know what lines you're talking about, my dude.
Now, the interesting thing to compare here is to note that, this civilization stretched for more than 3,100 years. And so when you hear people say that, Cleopatra is closer to us today in time than she is to when they say the pyramids were built, that's absolutely true. There's much more time in her past to get to, the proposed date of building of the Great Pyramids at Giza than there is for her to get to our modern time. So this civilization was vast, and it stretched more than 3,000 years. And it's an interesting comparison to make, when you compare it to our civilization. If we're generous and say, let's say our civilization, if you stay, well, it started year 0, that's roughly 2,000 years. I think it's more likely, 1,500 or 1,000 years to kind of get to what we would call our civilization. And there's a clear technological process and evolution along that time, right? We were much more primitive 1,000 years ago than we are today. Technology progresses in an upward direction the longer a civilization goes. That's certainly been the result and the observation you can make by looking at modern history and at our civilization. What's interesting about Egypt, and when we get into these examples, is that really doesn't seem to be the case. The pyramids alone, these were some of the Great Pyramid, the Middle Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, the Red Pyramid. These were amongst, supposedly, the very first pyramids ever built, and it happened right at the beginning of the Old Kingdom. And we'll see many examples of some extremely sophisticated artifacts that were supposedly from the very earliest periods of time that never saw their match
Such a fucking
throughout
scam.
the entire rest of the Egyptian civilization. It's a massive contradiction in terms of technological evolution and a technological timeline. So just keep that in mind as we progress through and take a look at some of these different aspects of artifacts. So it's important to kind of ground ourselves and talk a little bit about how we actually relate artifacts and the things we're looking at into that standard model of history that we just went through. This really started to pick up steam, and our picture of ancient Egypt was built out with the discovery and essentially the decipherment of something called the Rosetta Stone. And many of you have probably heard of the Rosetta Stone. It was found a long time ago. It's a Ptolemaic
right
era
at the door, guys.
stele
come on.
that actually has a decree
so
written
dumb.
on it in 3 different languages. It's ancient Egyptian in hieroglyphs, it's in Demotic, and it's also in ancient Greek. And this was really key to unlocking the study of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. The stone's been on display in the British Museum, since around 1802, and it was Jean-Francis Champollion who really did the first transliteration of these Egyptian scripts and announced that, I think in 1822, and from there the study of Egyptian hieroglyphs was born, and we could start to understand the things that were written on walls, they were written on artifacts. Along with that, we also have several different records of what you would call a king's list, which is a list of the rulers and essentially the length of their reign, and we can correlate those back to actual dates. And so we have this chronology of dynasties
I pushed
of
B.
different
I did
rulers
not push
of ancient
A.
Egypt. And
I did not
remember
push
that
A.
the ancient
That's
Egyptian
such a
civilization
bullshit, man.
was long. And
fuck
it actually
yourself, man.
ran
I hate
into
this
times where you can
This
actually
game is
start to
such a scam.
cross-reference history from other civilizations. So the
Okay,
Greeks and the
what's
Romans,
cool writing?
for example, could also record the names and the titles of pharaohs and rulers of ancient Egypt that you could then cross-reference with these kings lists, and so you start to get a good picture of time and how far back it goes. And this essentially gives us this timeline of ancient Egypt. And with that timeline and with the study of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, it's really the writing that becomes the bedrock of Egyptology. It's not the only way, but this is by far the primary way of dating objects, sites, and everything else into that story of that timeline of ancient Egypt. It's the writing. If something has writing on it and it's got the name of somebody on it, then we can say, this person had it made, maybe he made the object, maybe he made the entire site. That is the primary method for how stuff is dated into that standard model of history. Now, this is an interesting concept because there are some issues with it, and to explore some of those we need to get into, I think, one of the best examples for it, which is at a site called the Serapeum, which is just an incredible site. I've made many videos on the Serapeum, and I intend to make a couple more. But it's a underground labyrinth, a series of these vast passages and alcoves and chambers that contain 24 or 25 of these just tremendous precision carved granite boxes, or very hard stone boxes, granodiorite, syenite. And some of these weigh, with their lids, up to around 100 tons. They're carved from a single piece of stone. The vast majority of these boxes are completely blank. There's nothing written on them. But there are 3 boxes in the Serapeum that have some hieroglyphs inscribed into them. 2 of them, it's only one little passage or just one line, but there is one box that is pretty much covered in glyphs, and it's covered in inscriptions. And this is that box here. And you can see the nature of the glyphs that have been carved into this box. It's considered essentially to be the most valuable one because it has writing on it. It's the only one you're supposed to be able to go down and get in, get close to and look at. And I love this image of it because on the right-hand side, where we're looking at the corner, you can see how perfect the stonework is. It's actually reflecting the light that's coming from the corridor.
Is this some sort of like Australian sarcasm
obviously
humor?
Isn't a natural property of granite.
Like,
it takes a tremendous amount of work
he's on Twitch,
to get granite
right?
to do things like this. These boxes have incredibly straight lines. The interiors of many of them are just absolutely perfect, 90 degrees and flat as a mirror on some of them. And it's very sophisticated stonework, yet compare it to the quality of the writing that we see
I guess I don't get the Aussie.
Here's a close-up of some of it. You can quite clearly see this writing has been done by somebody hammering on this damn thing with a chisel.
Too boring.
The lines aren't straight. In fact, there's whole...
I think it's in the US.
The inscriptions are just skipped over the surface of the granite where it's too smooth. And it's very obvious that this is the result of a hand tool. Somebody going to town on this thing with a flint or potentially an iron chisel and trying to mark it up. There's a massive technological delta between the manufacturing of the artifact itself, the box, and the technology involved in the writing. I do hear some people often say, well, it was probably different people that did the writing versus those who made the box. That's not really true. Stone carvers are stone carvers. It doesn't matter how good of a painter you are or somebody who can do calligraphy. Try and do that into stone. Those skills don't really translate. Now, if you were actually doing the writing on this box at the same time the box was being made, you would have the calligrapher, the scribe come and draw or paint the glyphs and the lines on the box, and then you would have a stone carver come and actually carve those into the stone itself. And it would, it's the same set of skills that it takes to work the stone and to create the object itself. And I don't know about you, but if I was the guy who made this box and went to all the trouble and time and effort of getting all the lines straight, perfectly straight lids and edges, and then polish this stone up to where it actually is reflecting light, and somebody came along and wailed on it with a hammer and chisel like this, I'd probably be pretty upset. It does not seem to me to be contemporary with the nature of the box itself. Yet, it's the writing that's on this box that is used to date and relate not only the box, but the entire Serapeum into that story of the standard timeline of ancient Egyptian history. Also, we see here, we can find on this box an empty Shen ring. This is on the front of the box.
Sarcophagus, you say,
the Shen ring or the cartouche,
what
which
were
is used
found
exclusively used for
these
royalty
boxes?
and kings. There's no name.
What was found in these boxes?
Now, if there was the name of a king in here, say it was Ptolemy the First or something, if that name of Ptolemy the First was in here, we could say that, Ptolemy the First, clearly he's the guy who ordered this box to be made. He ordered the Serapeum to be dug out of the ground. It was all done in his honor. And, there goes the whole story of history. But this cartouche is empty. So what's going on here? Well, I think what's happened here is that we have to start to think about the concepts of inheritance and reuse. This site could be vastly ancient.
I thought you were so sure, man.
Vastly ancient.
You were so sure.
And obviously, if it's discovered or found by dynastic Egyptians, it's quite likely that this site was taken over by priests who found it to be just as significant as we do. We go in, you're awe-inspired, you're like, man, look at these objects, I can't believe it. They could take over this site and essentially sell dedications on these boxes. They probably did the writing. They were probably waiting for the highest bidder to come along and want to have his name inscribed in here. We know this actually happened because in the entrance to the Serapeum, all over the walls you can find these little indentations on the walls where there were very small limestone or granite steles placed in there that you could pay the priesthood to have your name or your whatever this dedication is put into the Serapeum. All of those steles are gone now. They were quarried in later times, but we know they were there, and I think this is exactly the same thing that's occurring here. The point to really take home from this, though, is that there's just a massive technological gap between the writing and the object itself, and it's not just on the boxes of the Serapeum. We can also see it on many other artifacts, particularly those found in the Egyptian Museum. This is a Hyksos Sphinx. Take a look at the very fine details that are shown here by the photography. The ribs are essentially using light to show their detail. It's an incredible carving. It's a statue. It's made from, I think, looks like granite diorite to me.
Do you know where King's tomb is?
Stone. But when you take a close look at the
And do you know where the
themselves, they are
serapeum
also
is?
very crudely chiseled
Do you realize that they're nowhere near each other?
The lines aren't straight. You can see the marks that come from the hand hammering of chisels. It's dug in a little deeply, but they're done quite crudely.
Do you understand that?
More details on statues. This is
these boxes.
This is an Old Kingdom statue, again, something that comes from the very earliest times of the ancient Egyptian civilization, and
these boxes are made of
it's made from
quartzite.
diorite, even harder than granite. And you can see the upper thorax.
The Valley of the Kings is made of
the
like
top of the rib
limestone.
cage here is shown up in the very fine details.
They probably even
It's
found the
polished.
Valley
It's
of the
just a
Kings
beautiful
already
piece of work.
made.
They were clearly able to polish
dug out already.
uneven surfaces. Look at the thumbnails.
King's Tut tomb only had
the fingers and cuticles,
like
even
gold.
though there's dust on this statue.
Didn't
all
have,
of
like,
these different
actual
aspects
real
of the statue are polished. This
granite
shows you
pieces,
that the
like,
creators of the statue were able to
unless little
polish
pieces that they
non-flat surfaces.
found,
You have to
put
remember
in
that
in
the
a shitty
standard
little
model
limestone
explanation
tomb.
for how stone was polished was that they used rocks
Yeah,
and
dude,
sand
you're
and
not
water. They would mix it
understanding, like,
together and rub rocks on it to polish it, which
you're being a
you can actually
fucking
does
asshole about
mean
it,
that
too.
sort of technique might work on a flat surface, but it becomes very difficult to achieve once you're talking about curved surfaces or very fine detailed surfaces like cuticles or fingernails. But we obviously can see that
Jesus Christ,
this
man,
polish
there's nothing to do.
was able to
There's
be
no
achieved
goddamn
by the
holes in
creators
this
of the statue.
fucking-
Another
Man,
example,
you're such
one
a
of the best
fucking
knees
asshole.
you'll ever see in sculpture, again, an Old Kingdom statue made from granite diorite or diorite itself. The bone structure, the musculature, all of this just pops out of this statue. It's incredible work. And again, we see that the stone is polished to a very high degree. Yet the glyphs don't
Like
show
you're a
those
fucking
same
fool
characteristics
because you're
of
showing the world how much
technology
you
that we
goddamn
see
don't know anything about
on the
goddamn
objects
shit. And
themselves.
you're being a fucking
This
asshole
statue,
about
again,
it.
it's that one of those Old Kingdom
Stop.
statues we were looking at. It's an
Stop being
impressive
an
statue.
asshole.
The glyphs are actually pretty well done, but if you look closely, you see the chiseling marks. You see that the lines of the cartouche aren't straight.
Huh.
You can see that the interior of the glyphs aren't polished. The interior of the bird,
Jesus
for
Christ,
example, you
man.
can see that's not polished. And this is something, once you see this on ancient Egyptian artifacts, you see it everywhere. You notice that the glyphs, if you look closely, you'll see chisel marks, clearly the result of hand tools, and you'll see that the inside surfaces of the glyphs are not polished. Compare that to the lotus flower motif that's below it. You can see just below this line of glyphs, there's a lotus flower motif that's on the side of the artifact. That is polished. So they clearly had the ability to polish out these types of surfaces. They could have polished these glyphs out, but it didn't happen. So what does this mean? The glyphs are massively inferior from a technological perspective to the statues, and they're not polished. Is it possible that these glyphs were added much later and in a much more primitive fashion?
You're not an asshole. I guess I'm just not understanding
example,
the sarcastic
a
humor
beautiful
or
Old
whatever.
Kingdom statue. You can see it on the left here, and then here's a close-up of the glyph that's just been roughly hacked into its chest on the right. I think it's quite possible that we're talking about two separate
these
timelines.
boxes in the serapeum
Remember that it's the writing that we find on these
are
artifacts
made of like quartzite,
that dates
fucking
and relates them
diorite,
into the story of history, and
granite,
these are still Old Kingdom artifacts. The writing
and
on
they're
them came from
huge.
the Old Kingdom, but the
And they're
artifacts
underground.
themselves have a massively
then
different
the hallways are
sophistication
narrow
level in
as
terms
fuck.
of technology and what it takes to create them.
and they were completed
Not only that,
not
but
like
these
outside
statues,
of the fucking
again, these
thing,
Old
but like
Kingdom
inside
statues, this
it.
is a diorite statue
some unfinished
from the Old
boxes in it.
Kingdom. Also show signs
Which does
of
support your
pretty
argument that it could have
sophisticated
been made by
manufacturing
hand
in terms of
because
overcuts.
how do they get the tools down? But now
You
get
can
these
find
fucking boxes
overcuts
down
on
there.
these statues along the seat, under the
It has nothing
arms,
to do with King
and you have to
Tut's
remember
tomb.
that,
King Tut's
again,
tomb
the
is
standard model explanation
probably
for how
even a
stone was cut,
reused
it's
tomb
grinding. So you're
in this
using sand, or you're
limestone
using an abrasive
ground
material, and you're rubbing on it with a
dugout,
copper bar,
which
or
is
you're
some
rubbing on it
lame
with a piece
gold
of
on
horn
a
or something like that. And the rate of
I don't even know if it was
removing
granite
granite
or
or removing
copper. It probably
diorite from
wasn't
that
even granite.
is tiny. You would have to work for hours and hours and hours to make this sort of a mistake and have it show up like this. On the other hand, if you're using a much more powerful tool, something
right,
that
man.
removes
You
stone
weren't rude
much
to
more
me. You
quickly,
weren't
think
rude
of
to
something
me.
like a circular saw going into wood, it's quite easy to leave an overcut like this. And we see the evidence for overcuts on these statues. Here's some more examples. We can see overcuts under the arms of some of these statues. We can see the remnants of tube
Yeah,
drills
you're never being rude to me.
between the feet of the statues, as well as overcuts on the inside of the legs. It's not only on statues that we can find things like overcuts. We see them made into granite, into artifacts like obelisks, which you can see here. I think these are obelisks from Karnak.
It's not,
and these are very fine overcuts, most likely made with circular saws. that have been made into just incredibly hard stone, and they're still there for everyone to see today. And again, right next to, hand-hammered glyphs. It's an interesting fact that the evidence for power we're not going to talk too much about the techniques and sophistication of tube drills or circular saws. I do have videos that go into it, and I do have presentations that I've made on those topics. But we only see the evidence for these types of what you might term power tools on artifacts. We see it in boxes, we see it in statues, we see it in slabs, on columns, on obelisks. You don't ever see these marks in the writing. You don't ever see these marks on the writing, nor on the less sophisticated class of objects, which I'm going to get in and show you here. So to round out the talking about the writing and how we date and relate stuff into that story of history, this is one of my favorite pictures. It's from a site called Tanis, which is in the north of Egypt, up in the delta. And what you're looking at is a block that was originally an obelisk. So this block is actually showing you a number of different things. First of all, it's showing you the concept of renovation and reuse. This is a piece from a broken obelisk. Most obelisks you see that are standing have the writing on them vertically, right? So that the glyphs are oriented in a vertical line. This piece has been repurposed as a block in a wall, and it's clearly been written on in a horizontal fashion. Right? You can see the glyph of Ramses II. Once you go to Egypt, and you particularly the New Kingdom sites, you'll see this glyph everywhere. It becomes very recognizable. This was Ramses II, but if you look closely on the right-hand side of this block, you can get a sense for what was actually going on here. Ramses was usurping this from an earlier installation or an earlier set of writing, and in fact you can see how he had his workmen and his stonemasons blend his writing over the top of a pre-existing inscription that was here before.
They may have
and he's actually written his name across the top of existing lettering that was probably put on that thing after the obelisk was repurposed as a block in the wall. So we don't know how many times this block has been inherited, renovated, reused, or even re-inscribed. Now, Ramses is often thought of as being, the greatest pharaoh of ancient Egypt, or the most powerful ruler, and he's often termed that way in modern literature. Flinders Petrie called him the Great Usurper,
if it was a tomb,
because the evidence of him usurping older artifacts and putting his name on them
that would make sense.
Exists all over the place in ancient Egypt, and it's not even disputed by mainstream Egyptology. In fact, some artifacts have as up to like 5 or 6 different pharaohs' names on them from different periods of time. How can we use the writing to determine when something was made? It just doesn't make any sense. Here's some more examples of features and writing that have been added later. This is at Luxor. This is a tremendous temple that's in Upper Egypt. These huge single-piece granite statues are surrounded by sandstone pylons and columns. And if you look closely at the belt line of a couple of these statues, you'll notice something. There's obviously been a glyph inscribed onto the statue on the belt line and also just below that. But if you look closer, you'll see that glyph has actually been added over the top of pre-existing
he's literally
features.
Talking about exactly.
There's a dagger or some sort of object tucked into this guy's belt here. And if you look in the top right-hand corner of the glyph, you'll see that the glyph's actually been inscribed over the top of the lines of that dagger. In fact, you can still see the line of the dagger there. Now, if you were making this statue with the intention of putting this glyph here, you would not go to the trouble of inscribing those features on the statue. You would design it in such a way that either the glyph was somewhere else or that the features were actually placed somewhere else so that you weren't, doubling up your work. This glyph was very clearly added at a later date. In fact, some of the statues here in Luxor have the names of more than 2 pharaohs written on them. And they were added later. Yet those names are used to basically attribute these statues. That's why we call all of these statues, they're all supposedly of Ramses II, because Ramses II has his name on them. I'm not sure that means he's the one who had them built, but that's how it gets related into the standard model of history.
Unless the engravers were
the size of this is a toppled over huge statue
makers.
You can see the neck piece and the,
also another
the crown edge, the shoulder and the chest of this statue. Quite clearly this glyph has been inscribed over the top
just didn't care as much as the statue maker
that were here on this statue.
It's possible.
So we know the writing could have been added later on these things, right? We can't really depend on the writing to date and relate these artifacts into the story of history. What about other features on the statues? These are all Old Kingdom statues that you're seeing here. I'm going to show that this exists across multiple categories of artifacts. It's a tale of two industries. There is a very sophisticated category of these artifacts. These are some of the ones that are included. The Khafre enthroned in the center here is one of the most famous, most complete
statues. Not have just
Old Kingdom. Again, it's named after Khafre because of some of the glyphs that have been crudely hammered onto it. Stuff. But as we talked about before, these show just remarkable technology carved into very hard stone. Just precise, perfect work, polished surfaces, just beautiful work. This is a very sophisticated example of statue making. Many of these also show overcuts and examples of very sophisticated tool use. Yet if you go and you look at other statues and other examples, there's a whole other category of artifacts that come from ancient Egypt. All of those examples that I just showed you were from the Old Kingdom. Many of these examples came from the New Kingdom, thousands of years later. You would think if you have that technological progression like we have in our civilization, that these might have been as sophisticated, if not more so. But that's just not the case. There are some beautiful pieces of work here, like on the left here, this is a young Ramses II being protected by the god Horun.
Oh wow, insane.
And the statue itself isn't polished.
That's
you
really
can see the hand hammering marks. It actually reflects the same technology that's used to carve the glyphs that are written into it. You can look at these other statues.
How did they tell
quite clearly see
beating?
they've been hand hammered. They're beautiful pieces of work.
Was it like
They're
some
astonishing. I mean, these are obviously the results of very skilled craftsmen, but they were using primitive methods and they were using primitive tools. These statues match what we see in the archaeological record. The other ones do not.
Scratched. Insane.
Some of these statues, when we get into some of the analysis, show a precision that really goes far beyond the capability of hand tools. I'd like to really acknowledge the work of Christopher Dunn in this area. In fact, these are screenshots from his book.
They scratched the cave wall that shows that
Chris
they were
several years now,
drawn at different times.
And he's really, I think, done some pioneering work in terms of analysis on some of these artifacts and showing that you really needed extremely sophisticated manufacturing systems in order to make them. One of the indications of precision is really symmetry. And if you look at the image on the left here, this is showing you the perfect symmetry of one of these giant heads that's supposedly of Ramses II that's found at Luxor. You can see that there's two Chris Dunns in this photo. He's sticking his hand on both sides of it. It's a reverse transparency overlay.
This is the symmetry thing.
What you do is you take a photo that's perfectly centered on the head, and then you make a copy of it, you flip it on the vertical axis so it's like reversed, and then you make both of those images 50% transparent and you overlay them. That would then show you if there's any discrepancies at all between the left side and the right side, and we just don't see it. It's absolutely symmetrical. It's perfect. It's absolutely astonishing. This isn't a feature of any human face. No human face is perfectly symmetrical.
That's crazy.
It's not a feature of great works of art like David carved out of marble by Michelangelo. It's absolutely astonishing piece of work, but it doesn't show these aspects of precision, and one of those is symmetry. This is absolutely remarkable, and it's not achievable by using hand tools, particularly not on the scale we're talking about here. I mean, these you're talking about 150, 200 to 300 ton statues, single-piece statues that are all made this way. And in fact, you can see that, and by doing some basic photographic analysis of a number of these different statues, by looking at the ratios between the eyes and the lips across different statues that are found, all around the world in different museums. Chris Dunn also goes on to show that we see the use of very consistent curves, the same radii, the same circumference of different tools are used in different parts of the face. This is indicative of the types of tools that are used. And not only that, the faces are very, very complex geometric objects. Perhaps it's a little easier to understand when you talk about the crowns that are on some of these statues. They're either a headjet or a pashent. These are like the bowling ball shaped crowns that sit on top of some of these statues. This again is a reverse transparency overlay set up on its center line looking at one of these headjets. These things are absolutely remarkable. There's a couple of them that you can actually put your hands on at Luxor. Incredibly smooth. Now, there's no straight lines in any of these things. You're talking about a compound curved surface that is made up of curvatures of flowing degrees. Like in some cases they with the top of the bowling ball or the bowling pin. Those curves reverse on themselves, and they're perfectly symmetrical. This is an extremely complex geometric shape to try and machine out of stone. And to suggest that anybody could create something as perfect as this to achieve this level of symmetry by hand is frankly ridiculous. And engineers and machinists and people that work in stone know this. And Chris Dunn commented on it when he wrote about these in his books, quoting Chris Dunn. The design and precise geometry that was crafted into Ramses' crown is a symbol of a society that was disciplined in precision engineering and craft.
Guys.
The pieces could not have been created without the aid of some kind of mechanical device that guided the tool along a prescribed contour. Neither was this mechanical device a simple machine. Applying the tools of 50 years ago to the Ramses challenge would severely tax craftsmen skilled in manufacturing, and the tools and instruments necessary to ensure such precise geometry would not even be in a sculptor's toolbox. End quote. These things, many of them which come from the earliest periods of ancient Egypt, cannot have been made with the primitive tools that we know were used in that time. This tale of two industries now, this extends the technological contradiction extends also to architecture. Let's consider the pyramids. There are quite clearly two classes of pyramids that can be found in ancient Egypt. On the left, we have the massively megalithic stone pyramids made up of huge blocks of stone. And on the right, we have
here in
the
Canada,
other
we have
that are all over Egypt. They're made from mud bricks,
petroglyphs
and
of
many
iron
of them
oxide
are decaying
from the native
slowly over the years,
Indians.
and they're starting to fall apart. Versus, the stone pyramids are still standing and mostly intact.
On like a granite.
This presents a huge contradiction in the technological timeline because, as I mentioned, these massive megalithic stone pyramids are supposedly some of the very first pyramids ever built. This image is showing you we're looking down one of the faces of the middle pyramid, and
years.
take a look at the size of some of the blocks in that first and second
So it's definitely new.
These blocks in the middle pyramid are far larger than those found even in the Great Pyramid. Some of them are probably around 100 tons, huge single pieces of limestone. This pyramid itself was also cased. The bottom layer or the bottom course or even two courses were cased in granite.
Yeah, that'd be great, man.
And you can see the remnants of all the quarrying that happened to those granite casing stones from those bottom two courses scattered all over the place here. It's a tremendous... I mean, talk for days about the pyramids.
Pyramids in the Amazon. Do like LiDAR with a drone or some shit?
These are supposedly the earliest pyramids ever built.
LiDAR the Amazon?
Pyramids from later periods, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, they did continue to build pyramids.
Totem poles on the way, dude.
These are made with mud bricks.
We
know how they were made.
Vancouver?
They were often cased in limestone, but their structures were entirely made up of mud bricks. And in fact, the only scene on a wall in all of Egypt, it's a scene in the Tomb of the Nobles, that shows pyramid building was this technique. It shows workers making mud bricks and then stacking them up. And essentially, this is how these pyramids were built. Interesting idea, isn't it?
That's amazing.
I've never look at all of these artifacts, and you consider the idea that, well, could some of these things potentially be older than dynastic Egypt? Could potentially some of them have been inherited? Start to think about the idea of replication, of imitation, of seeing the grandeur and the wonder of sort of precise statues, vases, columns, even pyramids. You might want to imitate those. You might want to try and capture some of the significance of these objects or this architecture by doing it yourself, by trying to place yourself amongst the gods. We see this sort of iconography throughout the entire history of ancient Egypt, the way pharaohs put themselves in amongst the gods. Then we get into one of my favorite topics or classes of artifacts, and
I'm sorry
vases.
for
these are often mistermed as pottery.
Man.
They're not pottery. These vases are stone. They're made from just a remarkable and just diverse number of types of very hard stone. Schist, even corundum, porphyry, diorite, granite, just a long list, lapis lazuli, all sorts of different types of extremely hard stone. Some of them, like the one on the bottom right, is a very high concentration of corundum in it. Corundum's a 9 on the Mohs scale of hardness. Diamond being a 10, granite being a 6.5,
assertive against me.
7, flint 7.5, copper a 3, 3.5, iron a 4 or 5, steel a 6.
The guy talking.
So, much harder than steel. Yet these vases,
Which, I mean, it is whatever it is.
Were shaped
I don't know
stone, pieces of stone, and they show just absolutely remarkable technological attributes.
But yeah, I don't have a horse in this race.
Some of them show just a perfect balance and symmetry. This is one of my favorite examples that's on display in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It's as if this thing is standing almost on the tip of an egg. I've got some close-up photos of the bottom of this, how there's only a tiniest surface of this vase actually touching the ground. But it's, again, symmetry is an aspect of precision, and this thing is absolutely showing it. It's just a remarkable piece of work. Some of these are also just incredibly thin. It shows a tremendous skill in manufacturing. This is a vase
I would just like
is
to
also
see
in the Egyptian Museum, and you can see there's a large
it.
chunk that's been broken out of it on the right side, and a close-up image of it shows you just how thin that material is. This is incredibly difficult to achieve in stone like this. All of those, the white markings in the stone, they're crystal inclusions.
Really?
Often of a type of crystal like
quartz
or rock crystal that is
singer.
much harder than the surrounding material.
It's not really my
which makes it difficult to carve because you're going from hard to soft, and also quite brittle once it gets to be quite thin. But you can see here they were achieving just a remarkable result in artifacts like this. And in fact, this is almost fat compared to some of the examples that have been discovered over time. One of them was discovered by the great Flinders Petrie, who wrote about in the Pyramids and Temples of Giza in 1883. The example that he's writing about here isn't pictured here, but you can see some of the sophistication of some of these hard stone artifacts. And what Petrie said was, quote, "But the greatest triumph is a bowl of diorite, translucent and full of minute flaws, which must render it very brittle. Yet this bowl, 6 inches diameter, is only 1/40th of an inch thick over its greatest part. Just around the edge it is thicker in order to strengthen it, but a small chip broken out of the body of it shows its extraordinary thinness, no stouter than thin card."
See a hole in the tape.
This is truly remarkable. You can see a number of examples of this type of work. You've got to imagine this being hammered out or rubbed on with rocks, stone chisels and rocks, trying to achieve this sort of an end it's frankly ridiculous.
One sec, I'll be back.
One of my other favorite things about these vases, and remember these vases come to us, they're generally pre-dynastic or very early period from a timeline perspective. They're attributed to very early periods, if not pre-dynastic periods
Western scale.
in ancient Egypt, and we'll get into some of the reasons why in a minute. But quite often in the displays, they're put next to other objects that were found in those same places, and they're put into the same timeline because of that. Like they found them in a burial that is dated to, pre-dynastic time or whatever, the 3rd dynasty or 2nd dynasty. And it's remarkable to me that you can say these things were made by the same people, yet this is what you see, and you can see many examples of this type of thing in the Cairo Museum. They're displayed next to simple pottery, actual pottery made from clay. You can see here you've got essentially a precision-carved, very hard stone vase next to a pottery vase. Not only are we looking at a pottery vase, it's also one that's been made up to look like a granite vase. This is clearly imitation work. The paint's been dotted on it to make it look like it's granite. It's hand formed from clay and from pottery. This was not turned on a wheel. This is a hand formed vase. You got to remember that too. Like there is no attribution of the wheel to the Old Kingdom period of Egypt. The standard model and Egyptologists do not attribute the Old Kingdom Egyptians with the use of the wheel. That includes things like the pottery wheel, the pulley, the chariot wheel. Everything was dragged around on sleds, and they used levers and ropes and human horsepower to make stuff. And quite clearly, the people who made this vase weren't using a pottery wheel either. The clay vase is hand formed, and it's an imitation of these other vases. Yet because it was all found in the same burial, it's all attributed to the same period of time. When you actually look into the manufacturing of these vases, there's obvious evidence for the use of the wheel. They were quite clearly turned. Now, Flinders Petrie was really the first one to discover this and to start investigating it.
Do you think they used
his work was then followed on in modern times by Chris Dunn and others.
Both.
This image is actually
even though I know they didn't
some
find
of the
any.
photos from Chris Dunn's book of him examining the very same pieces that Petrie wrote about.
Okay, I will be back in like a couple minutes.
You can quite clearly see the rotational marks of lathe-like tools or turning tools.
I think it's
again, no use of the wheel.
We're
in the
more
Old Kingdom,
exact. Yeah.
Before it either.
Like I think we're more
and
on.
Petrie wrote about the manufacturing of these vases.
There's a line.
Quote. The principle of rotating the tool
There's a line somewhere that we don't agree,
of rotating the work.
but we don't know where that line is.
To have been
in my
familiar
opinion.
An instrument
Right, we're like inching towards it. So like no steel.
The diorite
Yes
bowls
to
and vases
water
of the
wheels
Old
and like
Kingdom were
lathes
frequently
and
met
stuff.
with and show great technical skill. End quote.
Back.
So again, we have a huge contradiction, both in terms of technology and in terms of the what we look at and say the Old Kingdom could do. There's no evidence for the use of the wheel, there's no depictions of it, yet here we're looking at artifacts that supposedly came from that time that were clearly manufactured by a sophisticated use of the wheel. These artifacts also stretch far back into time, as I said, pre-dynastic time. Here's a few examples. One of my other favorite objects in the Egyptian Museum, which is a tube. It's a hollow tube of lapis lazuli with a gold sheath. This is a out-of-place artifact, if ever I've seen one. It's remarkably well made. I actually have photos looking up the end of it as well. It's quite thin. It's very symmetrical. It's a hard stone. It's been perfectly made, and it's in a display case next to bone and bead ornaments. Very primitive ornaments and artifacts around this thing, and the sophistication of making this thing is a worlds away from everything else it's displayed with. Yet it was found in a pre-dynastic burial along with these other artifacts. Did these people make it, or did they inherit it? Did they find it? We also see gourds, essentially these precision-made stone gourds from single pieces of stone, either obsidian or even rock crystal, which is a very hard stone. Again, all pre-dynastic. And when we talk about, pre-dynastic vases and artifacts like that, they do stretch far back into time, even as many as almost 15,000 years ago. This was a site called Toshka. This was excavated on what is now underwater as part of Lake Nasser when they put in the upper or the high dam in Egypt. This is now all underwater. This site was excavated in the 1960s. It's a quite primitive burial. You can see the guys in kind of a fetal position in the burial site, but in that site they found not only primitive pottery, handmade pottery, but also precision carved stone vases made from very hard stone. The exact same type that we see in other pre-dynastic burials and that are also attributed to the early dynastic period. Who was making these things and how did they get into these burials? They're very sophisticated objects. The vast majority of them, however, of all of these vases were discovered beneath the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, which is a 3rd dynasty structure. Djoser was one of the latter pharaohs of the 3rd dynasty, and beneath it, in all of the catacombs and chambers, there was more than 40,000 of these vases found. I've had the chance, luckily, to visit down beneath the step pyramid. It's a regular destination on our tours of Egypt. It's an amazing visit to go down there. There's more than 6 miles of tunnels that extend into the bedrock beneath the step pyramid, and there are actually fragments of these vases still laying around. You can see one pictured here on the right, as well as an image from Jean-Philippe Loyer's original excavation of this site in 1936, where you can see just a huge amount of both broken and intact hard stone vases. There was, more than 40,000 of them found down there. Some of these are inscribed. And once again, you'll note that the inscription is quite primitive. It's clearly been scratched into the very hard stone surface with probably a flint chisel or something like that. And some of these inscriptions provide a bit of an issue because they don't all say Djoser on them. Many of them show the names of rulers that existed in the early period, the 1st or 2nd dynasty. Not all of them, but some of them do. And this sort of causes a little bit of a problem for the mainstream Egyptology story, in terms of, well, how come he has them? And why were they found beneath Djoser's pyramid if he didn't have them made? Well, they do try and explain this, and I think they get the concept halfway right. And this is what you find if you visit the Saqqara Museum, although it's been closed for about a year or two now for renovations. But when I went there's a big wall display, and this is what it said about these stone vessels. The production of stone vessels before Imhotep.
Uh,
The art of carving stone vessels, which were luxury items intended to hold mainly cosmetic materials and ointments, reached its peak during the first two dynasties. All of the types of stone found in Egypt were used.
Like them.
Now, Imhotep might be a name that's familiar. He was the architect or vizier or
I think you
guy that worked
that
for Pharaoh Djoser.
Everything is
He's accredited with essentially designing the step pyramid. I think that's entirely true. He was a polymath, a genius. He was worshipped throughout the Egyptian civilization. And I think he was a guy that came up with a method for replicating these stone vases. And we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But they're telling you here that, well, you know what happened the first two dynasties, clearly that's when, you know, some of these vases were found. They kind of ignore the fact that many of these vases come from pre-dynastic burials, you know, thousands of years before the Egyptian civilization. They just say, well, you know, the first two dynasties, they could use all the types of stone in Egypt to make the vases. Never mind that there's no evidence in any of the other stonework that is legitimately from those periods, like first or second dynasty burials. There's no evidence that they were able to shape stone as precisely as obviously whoever made these vases could. But because you've got the names of a few of these rulers scratched onto them, and you know Djoser obviously raided these tombs to get them, then that's where they must have all come from. So they do actually acknowledge here one of the most important principles I think that it takes to really understand what's going on, and that is of inheritance. So stone vessels from the early dynastic period.
So do you think
more than 40,000 vases carved from hard stone were discovered in the galleries beneath the step pyramid. Many of these were heirlooms dating from dynasties 1 and 2, and it is thought that Djoser had them buried under his pyramid after they were recovered from earlier tombs. End quote. I think Djoser gets this. Well, I mean, he's doing the exact same thing that I think had been happening in the past. He was just a powerful ruler who decided he wanted to get all of them, and he probably sent out everybody to raid as many tombs as he could, and he collected up like 40,000 of them. But this concept of heirlooms and inheritance is actually acknowledged here. I just don't think they're going back far enough.
How heavy it is?
Were these things canopic jars?
Before you said it, yeah. You really
certainly sometimes they might have been used as canopic jars to hold the organs as part of that ritualistic mummification of ancient Egyptians. Funnily enough, though, displayed in the museum right next to these vases are the lids for the canopic jars, and you can see them here. They're very crude,
like the estimates are way heavier though.
That have now
for
formed into a hard
some
plaster.
of these are like 10, 15 tons.
I figure if you could make
some
the
huge
vase
ones
from this hard type of stone, you could certainly make a lid. But these are the lids that were found on sealed jars. So what is the standard model explanation for this? Well, that is also found at Saqqara. And it's a scene on the wall. It's in fact this very scene that's in the Saqqara Museum. There are replications of it, but this I think is the actual scene.
1,000 tons.
And what you can see here is, well, they've got these, weights are tied to curved sticks. Those sticks might have a flip point, and they're rotated around to make the artifacts.
You can see a guy rubbing on the
inside of a big vase with his hand, another one sort of polishing one of these larger vases on the outside. So, does this explain how these vases were made? Not even remotely. There's been a few people attempt to make, precision stone vases using this method. The results are laughable, frankly. Although, I don't want to discourage anyone from trying. I think it's a worthy experiment, but there's absolutely no way known you can make sort of artifacts that we've seen with perfect symmetry or wall thicknesses, of a corundum impregnated stone down to 1/40th of an inch and translucent such that it passes light through it using these methods. You're not even going to ever get anywhere near it.
Yeah.
However,
not
what
thousands
this method
of tons,
does show
hundreds
is the primitive industry of vase making.
1,000
alabaster vases.
That's
the
insane.
Industry of vase making that emerged after Imhotep. Again, this was all found at Saqqara in the 3rd dynasty. That scene on the wall was probably a technique developed by Imhotep or somebody like him in order to replicate and to imitate these hard stone vases. And we can see the results of that process.
That's crazy.
In all of these museums. Saqqara Museum,
what about
Museum,
the Colossi of Memnon?
Grand Egyptian Museum. These are very fine alabaster
the Colossi
vases.
of
First thing
Memnon?
you should know is alabaster, the stone, or also called white calcite, is very soft.
Granite.
It's like a 3 on the Mohs scale of
some of the biggest
hardness.
ones.
It's probably about the same as
And
marble, maybe a little softer. Much easier to work than stones like diorite or granite or schist. And you can see the result of that type of tool. These are remarkable pieces of work. They're beautiful artifacts that come to us from ancient times.
Interesting.
But they're not symmetrical. They're not perfect. The walls aren't, paper thin. They're clearly the result of a handmade process, and we saw that handmade process here. This is what this scene is showing. It's showing the production of alabaster vessels. And in fact, if you visit like the West Bank up in Luxor today, you can go to alabaster shops and they will show you this technique. They'll be using similar tools to this to make alabaster vessels even today. It does not explain the manufacture of the hardstone vessels. And what's interesting about the hardstone vessels, all of these crazy types of stone and these precise vases with symmetry and precision and balance and thinness, they pretty much all disappear after the alchemy. Joseph, I think, found most of them, and he rounded them up and had them buried with him. But they pretty much disappear from the Egyptian record after that. There are a few exceptions, of course. There was probably different kings that found some or raided some tombs to get some. And do you know why these vases are said to have come from later periods? Well, it's because they were inscribed. There was a rough inscription written on the vase that might have had the name of a pharaoh that came from a later period, and therefore
I guess we didn't.
He must have had that stone vase made. You can see how the whole picture, the whole puzzle of history and the story of the Egyptian timeline and how we relate artifacts into it is built on these assumptions of, he who wrote on it must have made it. And it's a faulty assumption. And it turns the entire timeline and dating of these artifacts really into a house of cards.
Yeah, maybe they had a highway.
It certainly doesn't exclude the possibility that these things existed long before
they probably would have.
the dynastic civilization ever arose, and they were just inherited and found and somebody else made.
Like build that highway of rollers.
We see this most effectively in the vases themselves.
Maybe not a highway, but...
So in recent months, modern analysis of some of these vases is showing exactly just how sophisticated and incredible they truly are. And again, we're talking about these hard stone vases from pre-dynastic and early dynastic times. There was a privately owned pre-dynastic rose granite vase that you can see pictured here. It's quite small. In fact, here it is. Here it is. This is a 3D printed version of this vase. It's decidedly petite, like 6-7 inches in height. That's how big it is. This is a accurate to size 3D print of this vase. And it was scanned using a process known as structured light scanning, which gives us a 3D image of the exterior of the vase and some of the interior down to about a thousandth of an inch accuracy, which if people don't know, in terms of relativity, you're talking about a sheet of printer papers between 6 or 7 thousandths of an inch thick. A human hair is between 2 and 3 thousandths of an inch thick. So we can scan this thing down to an accuracy of, less than half the width of a human hair. So it gives us a very good model to examine and investigate of this vase itself. Once you put it through this process, that point cloud model, it was analyzed in a coordinate measurement system or a CMM system by engineers and metrologists that work for a company that makes essentially parts for jet engines and in the aerospace industry by the name of Alex Dunn and Nick Sierra.
My line is terrible. I gotta go way more right.
Who I'd mentioned earlier.
Especially when I try this.
I gotta say, I'm very thankful to them for reaching out to me with their work, because I had no idea what it would turn into, and we've since this project has kind of got a life of its own at this point. The results that they found from this analysis of this point cloud model, of this model of the vase, was really the starting point for some truly astonishing discoveries about the sophistication of some of these artifacts. This vase is a pre-dynastic vase. It matches many of the vases that you will find from pre-dynastic burials and other sites in the museums. I often get the question about, how do we know it's pre-dynastic and what do we know about the provenance of this vase? Most of the vases, I'd say this, the vases that you find in museums have impeccable provenance, and that's why they're in museums.
I was thinking, how hard could this be?
Maybe private market in like one go. In terms of how it gets to the private market, a lot of these things were given as gifts to consuls and government ministers and people that have been involved in the governance of Egypt over the last several hundred years. Many of them were given as gifts to people like that. Many of them were probably taken from sites by foreign expeditions, and they eventually find their way onto the antiquities market. through estate sales and being handed down in generations and eventually being auctioned off, you can find artifacts like these on the antiquities market. They're quite expensive. And thanks to the few people who do have the means to collect them and are willing to let them be scanned and analysed. But this is absolutely a pre-dynastic granite vase, and in fact, any discussion around its provenance is really moot, and I'll tell you why once we get towards the end of this section of it, because this is by no means the only vase that we've investigated. Oh my god, I haven't played this in so long. So, by analysing the results from this scan, we can start to put together the geometry of the vase and start to define some of the precision that we can find in the vase itself. And I'd like to explain kind of how that process works and why the results are really truly so astonishing. So the vase itself is an ellipsoid, right? It's not a regular shape. It's not a geometric shape. It's not a sphere, a cone, a cylinder. You can't measure it and do geometry on the shape because it's irregular. It's an ellipsoid. So what you do is you take and you map regular geometric shapes to sections of the vase. And you do that by matching them using sort of thousands of reference points. So you apply that shape to the surface, and then you look at how precisely that surface matches the shape, and the more points that you use to make that reference, the better. So in this case, we used, in some cases, tens of thousands of reference points. So
what does that do?
As an example, here on the top of the vase lip, you can see in the image that we've applied basically a flat surface to it. We've matched it to a flat surface using 3,813 points of reference, and it is flat to within 0.003, so that's 3/1000ths of an inch. So it's a remarkably flat surface, right? What this also does, by creating essentially a flat surface on top of the vase, think of that as establishing a reference plane for everything else, right? You now have a horizontal reference plane, like an x-axis, that lets you start to derive an XYZ coordinate system to measure other parts of the vase inside of a set of axes and coordinate systems. Once you have that in place, this coordinate system, and you have the axes of the vase, so the top, the horizontal axes of the vase, the vertical axes of the vase, you can then start to compare the parts of the other parts of the vase in relation to those axes, right? So how flat or how perpendicular is a part of the vase to the top? How parallel is a part of the vase to the centerline? Things like that. So that's really the baseline for where you start with this. So you can see we've named that surface reference surface A. So now we can compare other surfaces to that horizontal plane or that reference surface
Most nothing I've ever heard, yeah, really.
From there, we can look inside the vase mouth. So you can see here with the iconography at the text at the bottom of the image, we've matched a cylinder to the vase mouth. So you imagine getting a cylinder in like a 3D program and blowing it up to where it fits inside the cylinder. And you could measure it with 5 points of accuracy, but in this case we've used more than 10,000 different points where it perfectly matches.
Especially in Russia.
The cylinder neck of the vase. And we can do a couple of things with that. So you can measure the cylindricity of the cylinder itself, of the vase neck itself, using more than 10,000 points of reference, and you see that's within 13,000ths of an inch of being basically a perfect cylinder, which is incredibly accurate. You're talking about a couple of sheets of printer paper in an area that's also quite damaged. You can actually see the damage on the vase here and the vase neck. So that's just a measurement of the cylindricity of the vase neck itself. What's even more interesting is now that you've got a cylinder matched to the neck of the vase, the cylinder gives you a vertical axis. So you can compare the perpendicularity of the axis of that cylinder to the flat surface that we defined by the top of the vase, so that control surface A. And this is where things start to get really remarkable with this artifact, is because we found that the vase neck or the vase mouth is 1/1000th of an inch away from being perfectly perpendicular with the top of the vase. Like it's just incredibly well made. So it's almost, you're basically looking at a perfect 90-degree angle. Like this is perfectly straight almost perfectly straight in relationship to the top of the vase, the flat surface on the top of the vase. So we're within 1/1000th of an inch in terms of perpendicularity. We can now extend that concept. Now that we have our center line of the vase and we have the top surface of the vase, the center line, being surface B,
still aiming too
we can
long.
now start to match other geometric shapes to other parts of the vase.
Slow.
And this gets really interesting. What we're doing here is essentially matching a sphere to this lower part of the vase body, as indicated by the blue stripe around the vase body.
Okay.
So again, imagine a sphere that balloons up and it matches this section of the vase. And in this case, we're using, 77,728 points to do so. And what we can do is actually measure that center point of that sphere in relationship to that center line of the vase. And it's within 17,000ths of an inch of being perfectly on that center line. And this is actually the biggest number in this entire report, but it's also probably one of the most astonishing numbers for a couple of reasons.
Fuck you.
One is that you're talking about a shape that's at the lower half of the vase. Like, you're a long way from that vase neck that defines that center line. And the other thing is that it's telling you not only is that sphere almost perfectly aligned with that center line, it's also telling you that it's an almost perfectly spherical section of the vase.
I think that's kind of the crux.
This was well explained by Nick Sierra in the videos that I had covering this.
You could measure a
sphere with 5 points on top or 80,000 points around it, and you're going to end up with a similar set of geometry. But if that sphere is deformed in any way, like so if it's a little squishy on one side, it's not perfect, that's going to actually deform and shift that center point quite a bit. So not only is this well aligned with that center point, it's also almost perfectly spherical, which it means that it's the shape of this part of the vase is amazingly consistent. Like this, again, remember that this was thought to have been used, created, this vase would have been created by some dude banging on it with a rock or rubbing on it with sand. This is precise. The surface is precise relative to the rest of the surface in order to keep that sphere regular, and it's been created in such a way that it's really close to that center line to a degree that is beyond, something you can touch or feel. This is absolutely remarkable because it tells you a couple of things about the manufacturing process. It's almost perfectly symmetrical. It's very spherical, which keeps that center point of the sphere so close to that center line of the vase. So you get a couple of pieces of information by doing this. And we've actually, if you watch the video that goes into the measurements, we did make this same comparison to a number of different areas of the vase. For example, the vase bottom. In this case, we're matching a cone to these sections of the vase bottom using nearly 60,000 points of reference.
See, I'm trying to shoot it more,
how perpendicular
instead of
is
going
that
against the wall.
center line of the cone relative to the top of the vase, the surface A, which is the vase top. It's within 5,000ths of an inch, which is just remarkable. And then the cone itself is also parallel to that center line of the vase, within 9,000ths of an inch. So this is, again, precision that's truly beyond touch and sight of a normal human being. You're talking about like a couple of human hairs, or in one of these cases, maybe one human hair off being utterly perfect. This is truly remarkable. And again, this is a portion of the vase that is the entire other end of the object from the top of the vase. It's really important to understand what this relative geometry means and why it's so important and why it has all of these implications for how these things were manufactured. This is simply not possible to achieve
so fast
with simple hand tools.
Damn it.
It gets even more interesting when you start to consider the lug handles, because even if you go, well, okay, let's grant them the use of the wheel, right? Which nobody does. Remember, the standard Egyptology version here says no wheel in the Old Kingdom. Certainly not before it. But let's say they did do that. Let's say we grant them the use of a lathe. Let's say this was made on a lathe. You have a problem, and it was spun this way, right? You have a problem with the lug handles, yeah? You can't make these lug handles on a lathe. The best thing you could do would be to leave a bull nose that runs the whole way around the vase
yeah,
where the lug handles are.
Suggest to
and then you would come back with another
first
tool
camera
and
too.
you would,
It's
you would
faster.
cut that
it is.
area away. But
it's just so
let's look at the lug
inconsistent
handles
for me.
themselves first.
It's too painful.
It turns out that they're astonishingly accurate. Not only relative to the reference, the grid, the X and Y axis that we've already established, but they're amazingly accurate to each other. So we can take lug handle 1 here, which is the one on the left. We can see that it's the cylinder that we match to the lug handle using over 4,000 points of reference is parallel with the top of the vase within 1/1000th of an inch. It's perpendicular with the center line of the vase to within 3/1000th of an inch, and we can actually define that cylinder itself.
So
as
I didn't even YOLO the second cam there, right? I kind of took my time. That's what you want to do for
and you
like
can compare
22,
lug handle
21.
2 to it.
22,
so again,
I don't know what you need for 21,
compare lug
but
handle
for
2
22
to the
for
top
me,
and the
that's what I
center
would
line of
need
the
to do.
vase. But if we
Like
compare
this.
the cylinder of lug handle 2 in
Probably
terms
not
of parallelism, it's 7/1000th of an inch off basically being perfectly parallel with the other lug handle.
Yeah.
That's absolutely remarkable. Like that's, particularly because these had to have been formed separately, right?
Like
this
that.
is, and even if it was turned on a lathe, you have to cut these out separately, and that's just a remarkable margin of error. Again, not achievable by hand tools. This leaves the question. So, if you had to come back with a tool, another tool later on, and remove this area in between the lug handles, how do you do that? What about the area of the vase body in between the lug handles? Well, we went and we investigated that area as well, and there's no perceivable lack of precision. This is truly remarkable, right? So, once again, we've matched a cone to this area of the vase body in between the lug handles using nearly 20,000 points of reference, and we found that the center line of that cone relative to the center line of the vase itself is within 5/1000th of an inch. Why is that so astonishing? Well, even in our best modern tools today, so assume this was made on a precision lathe. When you do a tool change, you come back, you have to change the process or change the tool, relocate this thing, go back to a different tool to remove the area of the vase here in between the handles. It's like doing a tool and a process change, even with our very best machines. That introduces errors, and in fact it's accounted for in the manufacturing processes we use today to make precision parts, jet engine parts, stuff like that. We just don't see that in this vase. We don't see that margin of error that we would get if we tried to do this today using that process, a lathe and then changing the process to carve this away. We would have a higher degree of error than what we're seeing here. That's truly remarkable, and it leads you to a couple of different conclusions. It's either they were able to handle positional tool change and loss of calibration better than we can today with our very best machines, or this was not made on a lathe and instead was made in a single pass. Now we're talking 5-axis mills, something that has 5 axis of freedom. So we'll talk a bit more about that. But the initial geometric analysis of this vase on its own was a tremendous discovery, and it really shows you the sophistication of the manufacturing tools and system that was required to use this. But that's not where it stopped with this vase. In fact, that was really only where it got started, because we go deeper down the rabbit hole with this. And I really want to thank the owner of the vase for allowing us to publicly release the STL file, the model. It's available for download on my website, unchartedx.com. You can go and get it today and play with it in Blender if you want to. But this resulted, essentially we open sourced this investigation now to interested people, and there were several of them, but in particular there was a Danish cryptographer named Mark Kvist. He runs a website called unsigned.io, and he undertook essentially a deep mathematical and geometric analysis of the vase, and really his findings here are nothing short of revolutionary. That's why I wrote it on the slide here. I think it's utterly remarkable what he's discovered. So what he did, he started with looking at, can we find a pattern of geometric shapes that sort of make up different features of the vase, and what he found was that yes, there was a couple of different grids of basically these circle of life patterns. This is this interlocked circular pattern that you see. You see it on lots of things. It's on the Assyrian. It's typically considered to be an element of sacred geometry, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. But he found that these circle of life grids match different features on the vase. And this looks complex, but it's not too hard to understand if you follow me through it. The blue grid here is based on the maximum internal diameter. So you see these 2 points D, they show that they're matching the measured maximum internal diameter of the vase. You can also see that this circle of life grid is used to determine both the top of the vase with the blue circle at points A, and also the center point width of the basically the upper part of the vase with these points of B. So the internal diameter and the circle of life grid based off that matches other features of the vase. And then the red grid with the red circles matches the maximum external diameter of the vase here with point C. It's also used to, we can use both of these circles and the way they interact to define the bottom of the vase. There's a lot that Mark started to discover once he started looking at the geometric relationship between different parts of the vase. So he measured and mapped lots of features, and he found a lot of repeating patterns and mathematically significant ratios. Not only that, but these ratios and these patterns had complex interrelationships between them that were using different mathematical principles. So this started to lead him down the path of like, well, perhaps this vase was actually mathematically designed. This object was clearly designed. Like these interrelationships and these ratios and these geometric features weren't here by accident. Like it's not an accident that he found them. It seems pretty clear that these features were designed, and then that design was executed with astonishing precision by some sort of manufacturing system, right? We've just finished talking about how precisely this vase has been made.
Check the tape on that one. Did I hit there? Is that it? Is that my bullet hole? That is my bullet hole.
But the key takeaway here is that this vase wasn't just made by some guy, eyeballing it with some rock and sand and pounding stones. This thing was designed. One of the interesting aspects of the vase is that a fundamental principle of its design is something called the radian, and the use of the one radian arc. Now, radians are pretty easy to understand if you don't know what they are. They're a method of measuring angles. It's actually a more elegant solution than using the arbitrary kind of, 360 degrees that we carve a circle up into. What you do is you take the radius of a circle, you take the length of that radius, you apply it to the circumference of a circle, and the angle that it forms in the center is a 1 radian angle. Right, so you can go all the way around in 2 radian angle, what we would call a 180 degree
wow, look at that.
Angle, or a straight, half of a circle is pi radians. That's how many degrees are in that, and we know that there are 2 pi radians in a circle. So it's a geometric model of measuring angles in a circle. And interestingly enough, several aspects of the vase's geometry are actually derived by the use of the 1 radian angle, or 1 radian arc. And you can see a couple of those examples here.
Level, man.
Those points B from that circle on the left-hand image, actually the slope and the degree of slope that's in the vase is actually determined by the use of the 1 radian angle. Also, the placement of the handles with that center point of that circle of life grid is also determined by the use of the 1 radian angle. There are several other examples in Mark's article, which I'm sourcing his images from.
UnchartedX.com.
This goes even further when we look at some of the mathematical aspects of the vase. The most widely used primitive geometric shape in the vase is the circle. So there's lots of the use of circles here, right? It's arcs of circles, portions of circles. Pretty much used to define many features of the vase. What Mark found, which is tremendously interesting, is that the radii of these circles, of all of these circles that you can see here defining all of these different tiny little curvatures and other parts of the vase, other angles and curves in the vase, can all be they're all tightly interrelated. They can be expressed by the use of a single equation. It's called the radial traversal pattern, and he found it by reverse engineering the aspects of this vase. This is a huge finding, because you can now start to understand how you might be able to express this entire vase in an algorithm, right? This vase was designed, and not only that, it was elegantly designed. This level of complex interrelationships between these radii that can be expressed in a single algorithm is not an accident. And if you had circles that were of a different radius, they wouldn't fit this pattern. Like, it's not just any circle that fit this pattern. There is a specific size of circle that actually fits this pattern, and it's those circles that we see making up, or the angles and radii of them that we see making up the curvature of the vases itself. So he thought, okay, let's try something. Let's create a CAD model of the vase that's based purely on the radial traversal pattern, right? So let's actually just create a model based on the mathematics that he's reverse engineered. He did that. And the size of some of these circles, you can see them here, there's 12 or 14 of them. The radii of those circles range from 42 millimeters at the top end, right down to 1.1 millimeter at the low end. That's a 25th of an inch. That's a tiny circle with a radius of 1 millimeter. But all of these circles fit the radial traversal pattern, so he created a model just based on that one algorithm. And then he compared the actual model of the vase to the CAD model. And this is absolutely amazing. He found that the median radial deviation from that CAD model was 9 micrometers. That's less than 1,000th of an inch. So 0.35 of 1,000th of an inch. That's just astonishing. The purely mathematical design is perfectly represented, essentially, within under 1,000th of an inch.
Thank you.
By the vase, the model of the vase itself. So this thing was designed using mathematics, and it was executed with an extremely precise manufacturing system. It's an unfathomable achievement. It's completely consistent microscopic precision that's implemented across 12 different radii with complex levels of interrelationships. It's all done in granite. I mean, this would be extremely difficult to execute and achieve today to this degree of precision and this sophistication of design that seems to have gone into this thing. So it's not only a radial traversal pattern. The vase also encompasses and shows other, I guess you would call sacred geometry encoded into it. Both pi and the golden ratio are encoded into the vase in several locations. Right. You can see here the inner diameter of the vase from the top-down view, or the vase neck to the outer diameter of the vase top equals pi to within 0.01 of a percent, and then also the golden ratio is exhibited in a couple of places actually, but at the top of the vase here, it's shown that the golden ratio squared is also shown up here with an accuracy of less than 0.1%. Now we're talking about sacred geometry, and the golden ratio is not just some crystal hippie sort of woo-woo thing. It's a very significant ratio that's actually defines how our universe is structured. It's an indication of knowledge. When we look at the vase itself, we have to now consider, okay, how do you go from design to manufacture, right? We know that from the precision, the complexity, the depth of interrelationship of the different circles and between the different vase features really rules out random chance. As Mark put it in his article, I love this quote, he said, it'd be far more likely for you to wake up one morning and have an entirely new quantum universe sprouting out of your left nostril than it would be for this thing to have purely had all these features put into it by random chance. This artifact was undeniably designed. Could you design it on paper? Is there an analog mechanism for designing this on paper? Well, you might be able to design it on paper if the piece of paper was like the size of the room you're probably sitting in. But you try and draw a circle with a radius of 1 millimeter and see how you go. We just have no ability to actually draft and draw out some of the microscopic features of this vase on paper at a 1-to-1 scale. You can't do it. Even if you designed it on paper at a large scale, you still have to scale it back down and somehow execute that in granite. So turns out the artifact is best represented mathematically. We can define the vase with an equation or a series of equations. This design, this mathematical design, was then somehow transferred to a manufacturing system and then executed in rose granite, no less, with just astonishing precision. And as we discussed earlier with the area between the vase handles, there was no perceivable loss in positional calibration or precision across all of these different curves, nor the area of the vase body in between the handles. So, as I said before, either this was machined in a single pass, like on one system, or they had a method that could handle, loss of positional calibration with tool changes better than we could. This is, a remarkable set of conclusions that we can come to that are backed by fact and analysis of the vase itself. So, how do we go from math to real-world output? And this is where the evidence and the logic leads. And I'd like to quote Mark himself in this portion, because when I had to read his article several times to really get it, but I think he makes a very strong point here. Quoting Mark Kvist from unsigned.io, quote, "As far as we know, no human beings, trained animals, or naturally occurring phenomena, modern or ancient, take mathematical formulae and equations as input and produce lathe operating motions as outputs. For all of the knowledge and insights we have accumulated over the ages, we know of exactly one, and only one, category of things capable of such behavior. The kind of thing that we refer to as a Turing machine. A device capable of taking input, holding state, performing operations on held states according to predetermined principles, and producing output. Now, you can make Turing machines pneumatically, mechanically, hydraulically. We make them a lot electronically. We call this class of device a computer, and no plausible way of representing, operating on, or manufacturing the design of this artifact exists without having access to one.
I wasn't listening, but I know
this thing had to have been designed on a computer, some form of Turing machine. A sophisticated one too, like not a very simple mechanical Turing machine, but something that is capable of taking a sophisticated design like this, represented mathematically, and then producing an output to some sort of manufacturing system.
But like a lathe.
The lathe operations.
That's why I was asking what a lathe. Like a lathe could create.
The manufacturing system itself also had to be incredibly precise and sophisticated.
Lines, right? A lathe.
Are we looking at the result of hand tools here? Of people rubbing
Not even
on
if
rocks
they intentionally
with sand
did
and
it
water
mathematically,
and
right?
rocks?
Just the rotation
I don't
of
think
it.
so.
Yeah. So
what can we conclude from this?
Like, I understand.
I think this artifact is much more than just a simple vase, right?
But I mean, like the statue of Ramses.
We know that it's elegantly
kind of
designed
crazy.
with an elegant system of mathematics that seems to be even based on geometric principles like the radian.
Simple.
In fact, the basis for their whole mathematical system might have been a base radian or a base pi system rather than our own base 10. It's an elegant system of mathematics. And more than that, encoded within it are the principles of sacred geometry, which turns out is the very fabric of our universe.
He said that you can't make those.
The golden ratio isn't just a random number; it's expressed in nature from the very smallest of particles to the very largest structures in the universe. The double helix of DNA itself shows the golden ratio. If you take a section of DNA, you cut it in half, and you look down on that top-down view, that shows the golden ratio. It's expressed in life in terms of plant growth.
I don't know how they made the
structure
handles,
of the human body. It's in the shell growth. Everybody's seen the famous golden ratio Fibonacci series of shells growth. It's reflected in the movement of hurricanes and cyclones, even up to galaxies. The movement and the motions of galaxies reflect the golden ratio. And some scientists have even theorized that the structure of space-time itself might reflect the golden ratio. It's a constant in our universe, and the fact that it's represented along with these other elegant geometric principles, things like pi, long before they were ever supposedly discovered, is indicative of the knowledge set that is being shown to us by the creators of this artifact. The whole vase tells the tales of its creators' capabilities, their elegance, their knowledge set, and as I said before, even their mathematical system, and potentially the way that they viewed reality. Now, this was really interesting. Once this research came out, it's a story I like to tell. Nick Sierra, who's one of the metrologists and engineers, he has a couple of degrees in engineering, deeply involved in the aerospace industry. I mean, he did all of that initial geometric analysis on the vase. But once Mark's analysis came out and he showed the actual true depth of mathematical interrelationships between this and showed that it was encoding some of these fundamental principles of the universe, he called me up. He's like,
I missed that cam by a millimeter,
man. It's keeping me up at night. Like, his worldview had just been fundamentally shaken by the results of this analysis. Like, he could sort of understand it. I think it didn't shake him too much to look at, okay, there was some precise manufacturing going on, but the fact that this data is encoded in this vase, and this thing is, at least 5,000 years old, probably way older, it finally shook his worldview to the point where he's like, I'm waking up at night, like, thinking about this because it's just blown my mind that this data is in there. And he related a story to me, which I thought was really apt, and I like to put it in here, in that in some ways, this vase is very similar to the golden discs that are on the Voyager probes, right? We sent out these 2 Voyager probes in the 1970s, and on those probes are these golden records. And using geometry and radioactivity and a whole bunch of other techniques that aren't just like we're just writing on it, these discs are sent out into space, and they encode information about our species, about our knowledge base, about where we are in the universe. They tell a tale for people that can decipher them, that can decipher all the information that's encoded in it. And in a lot of ways, we're seeing the same thing from this vase. This vase is telling us about the capabilities of its creators, about their worldview, about their sophistication, about their mathematical system. And, like the Voyager probes being sent out into space, it seems like this vase and artifacts like it have been sent through time. So I thought that was a wonderful comparison between the two of them. And in a lot of ways, we can see how this one object is much more than just a vase. So, where do we go from here? Well, I think, to start with, that it's extremely unlikely that we've just hit a unicorn on the first try. This was the first vase that has been analysed to this degree, but clearly we need to expand our data set. And obviously the other thing that I'm tremendously grateful for is the benefits of basically crowdsourcing this research and putting this out to the public and getting analysis like that we saw from Mark at unsigned.io. It's provided some just remarkable results. So several more vases are currently under analysis. They're being scanned. We're looking at even better scanning techniques than structured light. We're looking at using CT machines, which give us sort of micrometer precision. Also very accurate maps of the internal structures of this vase. You can see here, this is actually a scan of this same vase from a CT machine that gives us really accurate look at the internal features of the vase. And we've also made some promising progress with museums, because ultimately I'd love to see this research actually get us to a point where we can go in and scan and analyze some of the artifacts that are in museums that have just impeccable provenance. But in the meantime, we're working on some vases that have been come out to us from some amazing private collectors, and this is why I said the provenance isn't an issue, because some of these vases have just incredible provenance as well, and they're, let me tell you, tremendously expensive, and some people have actually on the back of these videos actually gone out and purchased them. And here's some of these examples here of just a couple of videos looking at some of the vases that are being analysed. This is a rose granite vase that's so thin it's translucent. You can see the light coming through it. Here's another vase that's also shows just an amazing degree of symmetry and balance that just spins perfectly on its tip like that. So we're looking at a whole host of different vases that are being scanned, and I can tell you that some of the results that I've seen coming back from the geometric analysis of them,
I haven't seen.
It's even more astonishing.
I think you shared that video with me.
That we scan. So some of them
Spanish?
showing,
she's a Spanish guy?
like literally zeroing the meter,
or a Spanish
in terms
woman?
of thousandths of an inch,
from the
precision.
width, the handles down.
Even more accurate. Like it's not a random one-off occurrence. Let's just put it that way. So look forward to much more analysis coming up on these vases, but I think we're really only looking at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this research. All right, we're kind of in the home stretch of this now, because remember we started this talking about the tale of two industries and the primitive and sophisticated versions. We looked at statues, we looked at the vases, we looked at the pyramids. This tale of two industries extends to other artifacts as well.
Oh, wow,
we're going to briefly cover a couple of them here. This is one of my favorite photos.
What material
this is out at the
did he use?
Pyramid. This is, again, an Old Kingdom pyramid structure, but you can see here, just even lying out in the sands, there is what appears to be a precision-carved, very well-made granite box. It might be granite diorite. And just to the left of it, kind of cut off from the image, you can see a very primitive limestone coffer, or a limestone box, undoubtedly a sarcophagus. These are representative of two very different technological
I mean, I guess
industries.
if you sanded enough, you could sand down
and again,
granite.
you can see this when you go and you look closely at the boxes that you see
Entire
across
life, right? Exactly.
Egypt.
I understand.
There
what
is
you're
a
saying.
class
yeah,
of boxes that is quite clearly handmade, and even they're hammered out of granite.
I wanted to get
some
into
people think I
marble
dispute
carving,
the
honestly.
dynastic Egyptians'
I'd love
ability
to do
to
that.
work granite. I certainly don't. You can definitely work granite with other stones and with flint and with tools like that.
You need like a chisel.
These boxes, there's 3 granite ones here and a limestone one in the bottom left. Absolutely the result of hand tools. Hand hammering, you can see it all over it. They're amazing pieces of work, but they're made by hand. On the other hand, there's another category of boxes. We talked briefly about it before in the Serapeum, but there's also an amazingly precise
dedicate your life to
ones that have flat lines, perfect geometry. You see
like
them in the Serapeum at Lahoun, beneath.
Not unlike
some of these go back to the oldest times in ancient Egypt. There's one here on the bottom right, which is in the Osiris shaft, which is 150 feet below ground on the causeway at Giza. You also have these strange boxes like the one in the bottom left at Elephantine Island.
I guess that's like your entire life.
Looking at that box. In fact, I have a video about several of these boxes. This class of boxes actually have just remarkable precision. Not all of them, but many of them show just astonishing precision. You can see on the image at the left here, I'm actually standing up on top of the lid of one of the boxes in the Serapeum. I'm looking down into it, and you can just see that reflective surface and just sharp angles on the inside of these single-piece, granodiorite boxes. You'll also see an image from the inside of one of these boxes. This is a box at the Serapeum. Again, you can see these just perfect 90-degree angles as measured by Chris Dunn as well as Ahmed Adli. Several other engineers have measured different parts of these boxes and shown that many of them are just these perfect 90-degree angles. Not only the interior surfaces, but also the geometry of the lids is just perfectly 90 degrees with the walls.
I hate this level.
There are some people that have tried to disprove this with some sort of sketchy methodology, I'll just say, where they're showing things like the angles of outsides of the boxes where it's quite clear they were never shooting for 90 degrees. They've got tilted angle finders and digital angle finders that haven't been calibrated, or they're just going out of their way to find odd spots. Not all of these boxes are in fact finished. In fact, let me skip right to that. And we'll come back in a minute. But not all of these boxes are actually finished. Some of them are still incomplete. You can see here there's a giant box in the Serapeum that's not polished, it's not finished. There's an inside corner on one of these boxes in the Serapeum that isn't finished. And even the box in the hallway at the Serapeum, clearly not finished. It's in quite a rough state, and it's been left in the hallway. That's me trying in vain to actually move the damn thing. So yeah, there is a spectrum of levels of finishing on these boxes. I'm not even convinced that going for a perfect surface and 90-degree angles was what they were actually aiming for. That might have been the standard template that they would get if they could, but it might have been more important for them looking for things like wall thickness and solidity of the box. This is a topic for a Serapeum video that I'm actually working on now that's been based on a lot more research that we've done in recent visits to the Serapeum. So
again, not unlike GoldenEye.
But you might think that, well, okay, so there's sophisticated boxes and there's primitive boxes. So they must have started with the primitive boxes, right, and then got better at their craft going forward. Well, again, much like with the pyramid, much like with the vases, even the statues, that's not the case. The most sophisticated boxes, in many cases, are the oldest, and the more primitive ones are the newest. The oldest known single-piece box, this is one from the 3rd dynasty. It's located at Mastaba 17. It's on the Maidoom site. This is in a megalithic chamber beneath a huge mastaba. It's thought to be, this box might be the oldest, at least according to the standard timeline, and it is a 13-ton single-piece precision carved box. So yeah, again, we're looking at this contradiction in the technological time frame. Some of these boxes have been analysed to a certain degree. I certainly think they're worthy of much deeper levels of scanning and analysis, much like we've done for the vases. But there's one box in particular that's been looked at by Flinders Petrie as well as a couple of others, and it's this granite box that's located at Lahoun. It's in a granite room The whole room is made up of granite with a curved ceiling. The box itself has just like a chamfered lid that runs around it that's quite unique. Not lid, the top surface. There is no lid known for this box. There's not a single hieroglyph anywhere on it or in the room. We have no clue about how old it is, although it's beneath a pyramid that's attributed to, I think, a Middle Kingdom pharaoh. And Flinders Petrie first discovered this when he excavated the site, and he measured the box and spent a fair bit of time with it, and what he wrote about it was quite astonishing. He wrote this in Ilahun, Kahun and Garob in 1891, quote, "The sarcophagus is perhaps the finest piece of mechanical work ever executed in such a hard and difficult material. The surface, though not polished, is smooth ground to an impalpable fineness, and most exquisitely flat. For instance, along the top length of 106 inches, the errors from a straight line are an average of 7/1000th of an inch. On the ends, 50 inches long, the errors are an average of 4/1000th of an inch. Lastly, after straightness, flatness, and parallelism, there is the question of ratio between the dimensions, or accuracy of proportions. This is far more difficult, as it requires all the previous accuracies, and in addition a truly divided scale, and an irremediable truth of work, since nothing can be corrected by removing more material." End quote. I think this is a tremendously important paragraph, this second one that Petrie mentions, because what he's talking about is the relative geometry of the object. It's the exact same thing we were talking about with the vases, when we talk about how spherical the bottom of that vase is to the top surface and how parallel or perpendicular it is to our reference planes. That's exactly what Petrie is talking about here, and it's one of the most important, the most difficult aspects of these boxes, and it is almost always overlooked by people who claim that these can be made with simple hand tools. A lot of people will get some, lapping stones, and they'll lap a surface flat and say, "See, I can do it." Or they'll get a piece of granite and they'll chisel in like an inside corner on the outside of a piece of granite and go, "See, we can make an inside corner." It's ignoring the most difficult aspects of that project, and in many cases those aspects are the relative geometry of the faces. How do you keep perfectly parallel surfaces that are 10 feet apart? How do you machine or create the bottom of a vase, the spherical nature of the bottom of a vase, such that it's within 5/1000th of an inch of being perfectly, parallel with the center line of a vase? It's a dishonest comparison, and people that dismiss or just ignore these aspects of these artifacts have no understanding of what it takes to actually manufacture them. Generally, it takes engineers and machinists and people that actually do the work. And it's one of my main criticisms of, I guess, the archaeological field in general, is that they're not engineers, and they typically do not listen to engineers and craftsmen that actually understand what it takes to create these things. But this is Petrie knew it. 150 years ago, he knew, and he understood. He was the first person to apply modern kind of engineering principles to these artifacts, and he knew the relative geometry of this box was mind-blowing. You can read it in his words, and from Victorian era kind of language, his mind was blown by this, and he had no clue how it happened, and he wrote about it. So as I said, they're not all finished, and again, in many places, the unfinished work, we can see signs of advanced methods of construction. We're not going to go into any tremendous detail on this, but we can see the use of pretty advanced either straight or circular saws in the construction of these boxes. There's other signs of sophisticated uses of tube drills on the inside of this box. This is in particular is one that's found in the Cairo Museum. It's an unfinished box. You have to kind of find it and then go around behind it to see the really interesting parts of it, but it is there. Even in one of the oldest boxes known, this is the so-called sarcophagus in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. If you can get enough light on it and see it in the right conditions, you will notice the use of sophisticated methods of construction. Very powerful saws were used to cut this granite and shape the granite. On the inside of the box, you can see the remnants from a tube drill that ran astray. A very powerful tool that ate into the wall of the box. It was a slight mistake, and you can see that, the bottom right image here. That's actually on the inside of the box itself. And there was also clearly tube drills used in the corners in order to create the radius that we see in there. So these things were not made by pounding stones and copper chisels. This tale of two industries extends also to the columns. We've seen boxes, we've seen architecture, we've seen vases, also the columns. There exists a category of just single-piece granite columns in ancient Egypt that is just truly remarkable. Truly remarkable. The best example that I know of a column end piece is at a place called Bastet. That's top right and bottom left here. And it's just a incredibly well-preserved piece. And you see the flared endpoint, some people call it, a lotus or palm-shaped column with the bull nose that runs up along it. It's incredibly precise and smooth to the touch. I don't know how this thing has lasted over so many years. You can also get a sense for how big these things were with me in the image next to one that was at Tanis. They actually came in sizes much bigger than this, but at places like Tanis and Bastet, it's like they were stamped out in a factory. Making this type of single-piece granite artifact is incredibly difficult. If you take a look at the top column here that's horizontal, you can see the shape, right? It starts thick at the bottom, it gets narrow, it gets narrow, it gets narrow, and then it flares out at the top. And this is all one single piece. This is remarkable. Even the Romans, when they made columns like the ones at the Pantheon in Rome, they're made in circles. They're quite rough. There's been some studies done on these, but they would put a different piece of stone on top because they didn't have the ability to flare out on top like this, because your single piece of stone has to be wider than the widest part at the top, and then you've got to actually somehow machine this entire piece out of that one block of stone and keep it perfect without messing up. And it's just incredible workmanship. It's just amazing to think how this might have been achieved, and heavy too. You're talking a couple 100 tons for some of these things. Even more when you look at some of the other, like Pompey's pillar up in the north of Egypt, just a huge column. And what's more is these exact columns, these palm-shaped, flared columns, come to us not only from the New Kingdom. Some of those columns are on New Kingdom sites, which we know they're New Kingdom because Ramses wrote his name on them, but we know they also existed in the earliest times. We have these flared palm-shaped pillars. We can find them at Abu Sir and at Saqqara and at Giza, and some of them are in the museum. There's 2 columns still standing that are at Abu Sir, and these are all Old Kingdom sites. So again, we know these types of columns, these exact type of columns existed from the very earliest times in ancient Egypt, and they reflect extremely sophisticated manufacturing in stone. So what about later periods? What happened in the New Kingdom? Well, this is what happened in the New Kingdom. There was a lot of what I think imitation going on. You can see here like these tremendous temples. I mean, not taking anything away from their beauty and majesty and wonder, but at Karnak and at Luxor, these huge temples that were supposedly built by Ramses II, they're soaring ceilings and massive columns, but they're all made from sandstone. And you can see exactly here, I think this is at Karnak, you can see how these sandstone columns were made. They would stack up, half rounds or blocks of sandstone, and then they would just rub them down and they would machine them down till they looked like a column. You can see that last column at the end here was never actually finished. And sandstone obviously is much softer than granite, and this is much easier than doing something in a single piece. It's a whole topic for another video and a whole other discussion, but a lot of these New Kingdom temples that are built from these sandstone columns and structures are built around a granite core. And particularly like at Luxor, there are single-piece granite columns in that core, but it's almost as if there was a pre-existing structure here that was then incorporated into a later design for a temple. Maybe there were some statues there. So, yeah, there's once you start to embrace the concept of inheritance and reuse and renovation, I think a lot of what we see on these ancient sites starts to make a lot more sense. Last topic we're going to get into before we wrap this up, and we're going to quickly go through this, but there's one other aspect. Other than this tale of two industries, the precision, the machining, there's one other aspect that I think is indicative of the use of advanced technology, and that is the logistics that's involved in moving extremely massive objects. And we have several examples for these. I firmly believe that the dynastic Egyptians were certainly capable of moving loads of 100, 150, maybe even 200 tons out in the open on a flat ground, enough guys on a sled dragging stuff around, it might have been possible.
Because I think his argument is that really they're different people.
Stretch credibility.
I think that's his kind of main conclusion from this.
Believability is when you start getting up to the 400, the 600, or even the 1,000-ton range. It's not just a linear scale of difficulty when you get into these sorts of massive objects. Material strength and failure becomes a real issue. The friction coefficient of trying to move these things across ground just skyrockets. I
think
and in a lot of cases, you're working in difficult environments like this case, right? This is the unfinished obelisk at Aswan, which is estimated to weigh around little under 1,200 tons. How are you lifting this up? It's on a gradient. This thing's actually on a slope. Look at the environment around it. How are you getting enough men in there to come even close to being able to lift that sort of mass? There's clearly a point where technology has to be involved in the movement of these types of loads. And we see examples of these types of loads not only in Egypt but across a lot of ancient sites. There are another blocks just like it in the quarry at Baalbek in Lebanon. This is the shot of what they call the stone of the south, or the stone of the pregnant woman, roughly also probably 1,400 tons. Was recently unearthed next to it. In fact, you can see to the left, you can see the line of where the bedrock and the dirt used to be.
That's the entire thesis of this video of his.
There's an even larger stone.
That there was two civilizations.
That's approximately around the 2,000-ton mark that's found in this quarry. And these are detached from the bedrock. They were literally stacked up on top of each other. They're limestone, they're not granite, but these are just tremendous stones that, in all honesty, the Romans who occupied this site and built the Temple of Jupiter on it probably never even knew this other block was down here in the ground. There's actually 2 or 3 of them in this quarry. This is at the quarry at Baalbek, just tremendous. But when it comes to Egypt, there's actually an even bigger piece of stone. It's in a quarry called Minya. Not many people know about this, but it's a limestone quarry. There has been the outline. There's 2 massive stones. Again, they're not detached from the bedrock. The trenches have been dug around them. On the top of one of them, there seems to be the outline of what might have been a tremendous standing statue. And there's 2 stones that they found in the quarry here, a smaller one and smaller I say, and a larger one. And based on the depth of the trenches and based on the average density of limestone in the Minya region, estimates of the weights for these 2 stones. The smaller one comes in at around 2,000 to 2,500 tons, and the larger one, I've seen estimates of its mass up to 5,000 tons. It could potentially have been a 5,000-ton block that was, at some point, apparently going to be lifted up out of that quarry and then used for some purpose. It's just remarkable. This is not something that's achievable with primitive methodologies, wooden sleds, and dudes yanking on it with rope. So, we know that these things were moved around though? They're not just in the quarry. There's plenty of evidence for 1,000+ ton objects, in particular statues. This is the Ramesseum on the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt near Luxor. It's the fallen over remnants of what once was a single piece granite statue, with, funnily enough, some crudely carved hieroglyphs written onto it. That was, of course, of Ramses II. The features of the statue that are carved, you can see parts of the headdress there, are just incredibly well done. The statue reflects a lot of the same technology that we saw in some of the very fine statues at the start of the presentation. But this thing, seated on a throne, as it likely was, would have been around 1,000 tons, if not a little bit in excess of it as a single piece. Just the pedestal that the throne and the statue was sitting on, measuring that out and going with a conservative estimate on size and the 2.7 tons per cubic meter of granite, the pedestal alone is around 500 to 600 tons. So you've got a 600-ton pedestal and a 1,000-ton statue sitting on top of it. Just a huge object. And although this is, it's within a couple hundred miles of Aswan, you still have to figure out how they got that granite from Aswan to this location, how they shaped it, how they stood it up, all those things. It's not the only 1,000-ton object. Obviously, I'm not talking about me in the photo, but rather the foot that we've got our hands on. And this is the only remnant of what would have been a similar size statue.
Yes.
Potentially, if you think of the size of the Statue of Liberty,
the same people.
The foot of this statue is about the same size as the foot of the Statue of Liberty. So huge single-piece granite statue. What's most remarkable about this statue is its location. This one's actually found at Tanis, which is in the Nile Delta, far to the north. You're talking about more than 1,000 kilometers from the quarry. So we had 1,000 plus ton. Like the finished product might have been 1,000 tons. The stone itself to get up there, because it wouldn't have been sent finished, it would have been sent either as a block or as a roughly carved block. Could have been 1,500 tons plus.
The nubs,
and you have to transport that thing more than 1,000 miles
casing stones of the
to
pyramids
the north, up into the delta of Tanis, where it would have been installed
and in
finished.
Peru,
and today, all we're left with is this segment of it. It's a foot that's been repurposed
also
for a
have
block
these
in a wall.
nubs.
But this would have been just an
really
incredible sight. More than that, we have another example. This one's at Karnak Temple. It's not made from granite, but rather conglomerate quartzite, which you could argue is actually even a harder stone to work than granite.
No one knows what the nubs are for.
You can see the remnants of the upper arm and the hand here.
What?
This is in the so-called boneyard at Karnak Temple.
You didn't know that?
Conglomerate quartzite is a compressed form of sandstone. It's incredibly hard. Very much like granite, but what makes
really
it even more
prominent in Peru,
difficult to work is the fact that it's a conglomerate. It has chunks of flint in it, and flint's a 7.5 on the Mohs scale. In fact, flint is used to carve a lot of the other stones, yet this material has flint in it, and there is, when you find pieces of flint
it is really interesting.
on the original features of this statue, it's evident that they had no trouble whatsoever working
Island,
flint.
Right?
There's no perceivable difference in how they work the flint relative to the
I think
the
Easter
quartzite.
Island has nubs too. I can't remember.
And it's full of fine features, particularly the thumbnail on this thing is amazing. And you can compare the thumbnail to the glyph that's been carved into the scroll that's in his hand. The glyph is very rough. It's obviously done with hand tools, and you can see these very fine features that are in that were carved into the thumbnail. Again, it seems like the writing would have come much later on this statue. The one other thing I like to mention about this statue is that because the arm is straight, they've put this together in recent years, the shoulder and upper
he might
arm.
not be making that
we know
conclusion.
that this was in fact a standing statue.
But
this would have been
if you bring
just
up the question,
tremendous
what
sight
are the nubs for?
When it was originally in place. I can't even imagine it. I mean, a lot of the statues, the big ones, were seated, but this was actually a standing statue. We do have some examples of how this type of load might have been moved.
But I mean, like in the walls.
One good example that I like to use, and I've talked about in a couple of videos.
Peru.
It's the Russian thunderstone. This was a large piece of granite that was moved in the 1700s from Finland. It weighed about 1,500 tons, 1,500 tons. When it was first moved, it was worked on and quarried as it was moved. They moved it across land. They had to wait for the ground to freeze in the first place to actually get it up out of its hole in a hillside in Finland. And the way they moved this thing across the ground was with a very complex series of these steel beams using massive bronze spheres as ball bearings, and you kind of see them moving the ball bearings up and putting these big rails in place.
There's like a
as they slowly winch this thing forward with deeply anchored capstans.
That's perfectly cut.
So right here in the 1700s, this is how this type of a load was moved. On a good day, they would move this thing about 150 meters, and that wasn't every day. But on a good day, they could pull it 150 meters. And right here, you're seeing just a huge amount of technology that is beyond what they say the dynastic Egyptians had. Dynastic Egyptians didn't use capstans. They didn't use pulleys. They didn't use, ball bearings. They didn't use steel rails to run this thing on like this. Like, apparently, the dynastic Egyptians did much more than this with nothing more than ropes, sleds, human horsepower, and wooden levers.
Oh, come on, man.
Kind of ridiculous. The Thunderstone's a great example to study because it's a fairly primitive, or at least, non sort of hydraulic diesel powered example of lifting or moving a load like this. It was eventually even moved across the Gulf of Finland to Russia, where it's now serves as the pedestal for a bronze statue of Peter I, and the stone itself is now only around 400 to 500 tons because it was steadily carved away into its final shape as it was moved. But this gives you an idea of what it actually takes to move a load like 1,500 tons, like one of the unfinished statues might have been. Tremendously difficult, even for our civilization only a couple of hundred years ago. So, what's the mainstream explanation for how these statues were moved in ancient Egypt? Well, this is how they say it was done. This is a very famous image. It's called the Djibouti Hotep image. And it is an image that was painted on the tomb of the guy named Djudi-Hotep. It depicts a team of something like 160, 170 guys pulling a sled with a large statue on it, and somebody pouring some sort of liquid in front of it. There's no other technology, there's no ropes, there's no capstans, there's ropes. No pulleys, just manpower, a bit of milk or lube on the ground in front of it, and a wooden sled. What's interesting about this image is that although it's used as a panacea for every large object like statue that was moved in ancient Egypt, we know something about this statue. Firstly, it was made from alabaster or white calcite, a much softer stone, even a less dense stone than granite. Estimates around this statue, and this comes from mainstream Egyptology, is that it probably weighed about 56 tons. 56 tons. Do I think you could move a statue like this that's 56 tons with this sort of methodology? Sure. This probably actually happened. They probably made the statue and they probably moved it like this. But under no circumstances can you use this to describe how you might shift a load of 1,000 tons or 1,500 tons, let alone 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 tons. It's just utterly ridiculous. And anyone who understands the dynamics of large loads and friction coefficients and things like that will be able to tell you this. But this is how it's explained. So, all right, in summary, we're finally getting towards the end here. We're looking at a tale of two industries. Now, we see this tale of two industries across pyramid buildings, boxes, statues, columns, vases. Most of these advanced artifacts are also, in many cases, the oldest, which is a massive technological contradiction. How come the more sophisticated artifacts aren't the newest? Like you think technology should progress as time goes forward, but we see the opposite thing happening in dynastic Egypt. Some of these advanced artifacts stretch far back into pre-dynastic times, like the vases. They go back up to like 15,000 years ago, and then they disappear from that civilization very early on. What's going on here? How does this make any sense?
Well, I've told the legend. What's up, man?
We know that hieroglyphs are the bedrock of Egyptology, and they're used to date and relate artifacts into the story of history. Yet there's a significant technological delta between the glyphs and the object themselves, and we see this all over the place.
How was your marathon?
We also have lots of evidence for later editions of glyphs, or for overwritten glyphs, for pharaohs writing their names on artifacts they clearly usurped. How can we date that artifact based on what's written on it? We've also seen that the logistics involved in moving massive objects, the evidence for machining and precision, that's far beyond the tools and the techniques of the archaeological record. Remember that the tools and techniques in the archaeological record are things like flint and copper chisels and pounding stones. Not much else.
Oh, no way.
There's the modern analysis that's been done recently on the granite vases is showing just an inexplicable degree of sophistication, right down to the point that, well, it's a fairly strong conclusion that you might have even needed a computer and a really sophisticated manufacturing system to make them.
I'm actually going to sign off.
These conclusions are being come to by engineers, by craftsmen, by cryptographers, and in general, archaeologists are not any of those things. Although, as I like to say,
5 more minutes,
you wouldn't ask an archaeologist to design the chair that he's sitting on, but if it's an ancient chair, then he's going to claim providence over it and expertise over it. But that's not the way that it works. So what are the possible explanations for what we see? Well,
I don't know why I'm not hitting
one explanation is, and as many people claim, everything was created by the dynastic civilization. So this must mean, based on the evidence, that there was a high technology industry existing alongside a low-tech one, because we have evidence for both. We have the artifacts, and we also see both of these artifacts spread across pretty much the entire period of time. So they must have existed, a high-tech industry and a low-tech industry at the same time. Yet, we haven't found any of the tools for the high-tech process. We have found the tools for the low-tech process. They didn't draw any of the scenes or leave us any descriptions or any evidence whatsoever for the high-tech process. They certainly did so for the low-tech process. We have depictions of the building of mud brick pyramids. We have depictions of them making handmade alabaster vases. We have depictions of them moving 50-ton loads. We don't have anything that explains the other artifacts. The only other explanation, if the dynastic Egyptians didn't make everything, was that they didn't, and that they could not make everything. So, in that case, some artifacts, perhaps architecture, must have been inherited. Somebody must have made them. An earlier civilization must have existed at some point. a sophisticated civilization, one that utilized forms of advanced technology, which we see evidenced in the artifacts and in the achievements. This civilization, clearly we have no record of it. It's lost in time, but its remnants must have been inherited and then subjected to thousands of years of renovation, of reuse, and also destruction. Remember, a lot of this stuff has just been quarried and destroyed and torn apart and reused throughout the centuries and millennia since it's been there.
Time tourists from the future.
We can also ask the question, what do the Egyptians themselves say?
Really.
We talked about the King's List earlier, but there's actually a couple of different sources for documents that go back even further than the King's List. The King's List gives us this, the list of kings from Menes of the first pharaoh of the first dynasty in 3150 BC. But there are a couple of other documents like the Turin Papyrus and the Turin's King's List that go back far further. The Turin Papyrus describes a time known as Zep-Tepi, the time of the gods, when the Neteru, or the gods, walked the earth themselves. And they had mystical, magical powers. These are the gods that are described in the sort of traditional Egyptian pantheon. And it's said there that they reigned for some 23,200 years. And they were followed by the Shemsu Hor, the venerables of Shemsu Hor, who were followers of Horus. Again, these semi-divine kings who also displayed mystical powers. And they were said to have reigned for 13,420 years. This gives us a total of some 36,620 years before the dynastic Egyptian civilization ever started. A lot of the dynastic Egyptian history describes them as a legacy civilization, and they describe this as their history, not as some sort of myth and legend. We pretty much arbitrarily make that decision for them in our interpretation of their origin stories. Is it time to rewrite the history of civilization? Could we be looking at the remnants of 2 or even more civilizations that existed deep in prehistory? You have to include the concept and think about the concept of inheritance, of renovation, of reuse, of imitation when you look at these ancient artifacts. These contradictions are in plain sight, but they're very easily explained when you consider these concepts: inheritance, imitation, renovation, and reuse. There is a very clear and distinct level of technology here. There is a high-tech industry that seems to have existed, and there's a low-tech industry. And we have proof in the dynastic Egyptian civilization for a low-tech industry, and the high-technology objects, these sophisticated objects, obviously showing some sophisticated capability, but they do not match what we know about the dynastic Egyptians, and it doesn't seem likely that they made it. And if they didn't make them, then somebody must have. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on the standard model of history now to change its scope, that standard model of history that we started with. It's not just this evidence for ancient tech, it's coming from the discovery of recent cataclysm with the Younger Dryas, new discoveries across archaeology with Göbekli Tepe, the Amazon, what's happening in Turkey, scientific advances in our own research in terms of DNA and everything else. And all of these things are vectors of change that should be shifting our perspective of our own history on this planet. And I think we have to ask ourselves here, what would it mean? What would it mean to us if we rewrote the history of human civilization on this planet? What would it potentially change if we went from this concept of 6,000 years, we went from a stone age to a space age, and instead of that, we had a global shift in awareness of a concept of what it meant to be a human being to something more like this. Could this be a new tenet for what it means to be in modern civilization, what it means to be on a human on the planet today? If we understood that instead of being the only civilization that's ever existed, some sort of preordained linear path from the Stone Age, that in fact we're part of some circular motion, some repeating pattern that oscillates between civilization and cataclysm, what would that mean for us? Do you think we could actually change this perception? I think it's possible. You can find a couple of examples for this. I think one in particular, whether you like it or you don't, or you agree with it or you don't, but there's been a massive shift in the global zeitgeist and awareness when it comes to climate change. Right? It's as politicized and as silly as some of the arguments are, it's undeniable that in the last 20 or 30 years, climate change has shifted the way we think about investments,
like space-time continuum,
decisions, interactions with each other, interactions with the planet. It's changed our behavior. This type of change is actually possible, if more people understand it and it gets into what is ultimately
go through
the
along the
zeitgeist,
space-time continuum of your life,
the global consciousness of human beings. And I'd certainly like to think that if this type of a shift could happen for us, then it might mean something like, we spend a little less money on tanks and guns and fighting each other, and maybe a little bit more money and focus on space exploration and getting out and solving some of the true long-term challenges that our civilization faces. Because on a long enough timeline,
does that mean
this little return to cataclysm, it's 100% guaranteed to happen again. And we're in a unique place in terms of civilization and technology to be able to do something about it, if only we had the will and the mind to do it. Thank you guys for listening. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Jesus' Sermon on the Mount being incredible to his feet is part of the time travel question. Interesting. Alright guys, I think I'm gonna sign off in a minute or two. In a singular universe. Interesting. Alright, I think I'm gonna sign off now. Oh my gosh. You don't believe in a single universe? Alright, let's read somebody. Thanks for being here, Quills TTV. Appreciate that, man. Toad, all lurkers. Congrats on the marathon. Thanks for being here. We're gonna raid somebody. Have a good one, yo. You too, man. Thanks, dude. Thanks, man. Appreciate that, dude. You too. Toad is still streaming? Toad, it says you're live, but I can't see your content. Alright, we're gonna raid Toad. Thanks for being here. Thanks, man. Thanks, dude. Thanks, dude. I appreciate that. Nice talk, nice discussion. See you later.